4 years ago, I needed serious surgery to remove a tumor in my brain. The doctor said everything was going to be nice and easy, but it took me 2 years to return and finish school. The surgery went so poorly that while anesthesiologists and nurses were trying to keep me alive, the surgeon had a conference with my parents to keep them up to speed. Brain bleeding, severe swelling in the brainstem, etc. What's weird is that during this conference, my mum's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed it was coming from my cell phone. I had put my dad in charge of my cell phone in case the worst were to happen, notify my friends and my girlfriend that I had passed. Anyway, he pulls out my phone from his pocket and it's turned off with the battery removed. They wrap up the meeting with the surgeon and then they walk to the nurse's station to thank them for looking after me. My mum's phone buzzes twice. She has a voicemail left by whoever was calling her from my phone. She listened to it and she heard my voice. "Hey Mum, it's me. I know things are weird right now, but I'm sitting here on this bench and I'm warm. I think everything's gonna be okay. Talk to you later. Say hi to Dad for me." About a month after the surgery, when I had recovered and moved back home, my mum had me listen to the voicemail, and I couldn't believe it. I turned white. I cried. When I heard my own voice, I thought maybe I had died and was being punished. I immediately opened my phone and looked through the call history. There, I saw the timestamp of an outgoing call on the date of my surgery, 20 minutes after I was wheeled into the operating room. I don't know what in the world caused this. This was last summer, about a year ago. I was in rehab and decided to make a Ouija board, and me and my 3 roommates all agreed we would try it out. We were all very skeptical, mostly leaning towards the side of disbelief, but still open. It was a full moon that night. We started by all holding hands in a circle around the board and saying that we were open to spirits, willing to talk, and I guess just putting the energy out there. We then took the planchette and moved it around the board in circles a few times. We were in rehab with no access to the internet, so kind of just doing what we felt was right, and weren't sure on proper procedures. When we were all moving our hands, we were heavy on the board, and you could feel it being dragged. I will admit I tried moving it on my own, as well as in the beginning just to mess with my friends, but again the planchette felt like it was being dragged. But then I stopped and began to take it seriously, and when it was actually moving. It's hard to explain, but there was an entirely different energy to it. It glides across the board like butter. The board and planchette, of course, were made of cardboard, so it freaked us all out. Sometimes a couple of us would take our hands off, or we'd tell another girl to move her hand and it would keep going. It spells one of the girls' names, Sally. We ask who's contacting her and it said, sister. Sally had a little sister that died under her care when they were small. Sally was scared. She asked for its name and it spelled F-L-O-R. I'm thinking maybe it's trying to say Florida but stopped, but at this point Sally is shaking and in tears. Her sister name was Flor. None of us knew that. After that, I think we contacted another spirit and said that it was female and had been shot, and maybe another one. It's crazy because the energies feel different, like how it glides across the board. So now we're all total believers. I think maybe the next night or 2 nights after, me and my roommate decide to play. I think we contacted a spirit similar to the last one when all of a sudden the vibe completely changes. It spells out my name. And I'm like, oh no, as my name is very unique, and even though I believe in this now, that's the last thing I wanted to happen, for something to address me directly. Then the planchette starts zooming back and forth between A and Z really fast over and over, basically flying out of our hands. We're kind of scared, and no matter what we ask, it keeps repeating the same letters over and over, and we get spooked and stop playing. The next night we decide to try again. Start like usual, putting forth our intentions, doing circles and asking how many spirits were there with us. My name was spelled out again, and I asked who it was, and it said father. My friend asked me if my dad was dead, so I said no. We asked it what it wanted, and dude, it was spelling out painful, and then went back to doing the AZ thing. Deciding it wasn't going anywhere, we said goodbye and put it away. We tried one more night, but it was the same spirit messing with us with the same letters over and over. So, didn't do it again. The whole experience was so insane to me. I kept a journal of all of this when it happened. So, I went and looked, and tried to give all the details I could for you to understand the experience. There's a small island called Ilha de Queimada Grande off the coast of Sao Paulo, Brazil, that is home to the highest concentration of golden lancehead vipers, one of the most venomous species of snake in the world. They are unique to this island alone, and its venom causes your flesh to rot off to your bones. The island is so densely packed with these snakes that there are up to 5 snakes per square meter on this island. You could stand anywhere on the island and be no more than a few feet away from a golden lancehead viper. Apparently there was only a lighthouse keeper who lived on the island with his family, but they didn't survive long. After a while, snakes crawled through their windows. Panicking, they ran outside into the forest where they were confronted by thousands of snakes, and were bitten numerous times running through the forest, hanging overhead by branches. They all died before they could reach their boat, and their bodies were found scattered through the forest later by a navy vessel making a routine supply stop. There was also an attempt to build a banana plantation on the island, but that quickly ended in disaster, as all the workers were dying from the vipers. The island is forbidden to civilians by the Brazilian Navy. I'm in my early 20s. I'm waitress/bartender at a hotel restaurant. Construction workers in our town often stayed at the hotel and would come eat and drink at the restaurant. I met a really tall, cute guy. Not a creep, but ultimately a prick. And whenever he was in town, we would hang out and stuff. He lived 2 states over, but was in my area a lot. So one time he was working a job and staying in a town the state over, and I drove to meet him. When I got to his hotel, we went to the hotel bar and had a few drinks with some other construction guys that happened to be there, not his company. Then went back to the room. Later we decided to order food from the bar. The prick was in the shower when the bar called, so I went and picked up our food. When I got down there, the guys that we were drinking with earlier were still there and were pretty sauced by this point. The bartender was busy for a while, so I sat and played with the digital slots. One of the construction guys came over and immediately started hitting on me and trying to touch me, and put his arm around me and stuff, despite knowing full well I was there with someone else. He kept telling me his room number over and over, and had to directly, loudly, tell him to get the hell away from me multiple times, and he finally did only once the others started noticing. In my flustered rage, I grabbed my food from the bartender and went back to the room and told him all about it. He rolled his eyes and kind of shrugged it off, and I was really put off by it all and really felt vulnerable. That's when I realized my phone was gone. I left it on the bar at the slot machine. So the prick and I went looking for it. The guys were all gone, but the bartender told me the creep took my phone and assured him he was going to return it to me. Great. Then I remembered that he had told me his room number. I told the prick this, and he of course passively accused me of asking for it. I didn't care, and marched him to the creep's room. I knocked, and the prick, who's 6'7", stayed to the side out of view of the peephole to see what would happen. The creep, way too enthusiastically, swung the door open and grabbed my wrist, and proceeded to try and pull me into the room. Thank God for the prick, who then stepped behind me and yelled, "Hey," to the creep, who was half his size, and I'll never forget the look on his face, like he just shat a brick. I yanked my arm and yelled, "Give me my phone." The creep then lied and said he didn't have it, and the bartender was lying. The prick didn't do anything else at this point, so we just left. I felt defeated and unsafe and annoyed and just wanted to go, but I couldn't because I didn't have my phone. I managed to sleep a little that night but woke up at 4:30 when the prick left to go to work. I stayed in the hotel till about 7 and was fuming, and then decided to do something about it. I gathered my stuff and went and found a maintenance man who was working in the pool area. I contemplated telling him the whole story but decided to just damsel in distress to avoid any more drama. I told him I was leaving and realized I'd locked my phone in my room and gave him the creep's room number. I knew the creep would be already at his job site, so we went to the room and I had the maintenance man call my cell phone from his. Sure enough, you could hear a faint vibration through the door. He took this as proof of it being my room and opened the door and let me in. I thanked him and left. There it was, just sitting on the bathroom counter. My phone. I grabbed it and turned to leave, but decided my petty ass wasn't done yet. I took the creep's toothbrush and ran it along under the toilet room and put it back in the same spot. Then I happily left, phone in hand, and stopped seeing the prick for good. I still smile knowing that the creep had to notice that my phone was gone, but probably had no idea how I got it back, or that he was brushing his teeth with toilet water. Nearly 10 years ago, I dated a girl for several months. There had been a few red flags right from the start that I think I should have listened to, but I was naive and kept telling myself that she was a decent person with a terrible streak of bad luck. Our second date was the first time I went to her apartment. We were having a few drinks, watching movies on a computer, and ended up doing it right there on her couch. We started dating officially, and it doesn't take long for her to start exhibiting some of the classy, clingy girlfriend traits. I'm a little bit put off by it, but just tell myself that I'm overreacting, and not to break it off because she's a little clingy and insecure. A few months later, I was hanging around her apartment when I found a shoebox in her pajama drawer full of things from her last relationship, which was with a guy. I should mention here that I'm a lesbian. Letters, nude photos, all of them together, all kinds of stuff. I thought it was really strange, beyond the obvious reasons, because everything she told me about this relationship sounded awful. She said he'd hit her, throw her around, say nasty things to her that had turned her off from men, and generally crappy relationship stuff. Whenever I asked her why she had this box, she shrugged it off and didn't really give me an answer. I'm not a jealous person, so I figured it was some sort of healing process, again naive, but I pretty much forgot about it. Here's where it starts to get really fun. Fast forward a few months. One night we're talking, and she tells me this story about a man that her mum dated when she was 6 or 7 years old that she didn't like. The man had a son that was about 10 years old that lived with him. She wanted her mum's boyfriend gone, so she told her mum that he had touched her one night while he was looking after her and his son. He didn't, and had him arrested. The son told police that nothing had happened and that he'd been there with her the whole night, but the man went to prison anyway and was beaten to death by a biker gang. She ended this story with a laugh and said, "I wonder where they buried him." Then just continued on with her day, as if she hadn't just dropped this giant WTF story on me. To this day I still don't know if it even happened, or if she made it all up to show me how evil she could be. Either one is insane. I decided right there and then that I needed to break it off with her, unleashing the "I'll come to your house and end you in your sleep" type of psycho I knew was in her somewhere. It takes a few weeks, but I managed to end it. She still messaged me constantly, and I was getting better at not being sucked into her guilt trips. Then she started sending me webcam photos of us that I'd never seen before. I didn't connect where they were from until she started sending me videos. Remember that second date at her apartment? She recorded the whole thing on her webcam. I had no idea. My stomach still knots and my blood still boils when I think about this. About 2 months after the breakup, I got an ominous goodbye type message from her, also saying she wanted to see me one last time. I lived on the opposite end of the city and really didn't like taking a 2-hour bus commute to go deal with more of her melodramatic nonsense. So I contacted 2 of her friends that lived nearby, one that was 6 months pregnant, and asked if they could go check on her. My day goes on until I get a phone call from the police. They filled me in with what happened. When the friends went to her apartment, she answered the door wielding a large knife and went ballistic when she realized I wasn't there. The friends ran and called the police. The officers arrived and they had to put her in cuffs and took her to a psych ward. After looking through the apartment, cops found her bedroom covered with lit candles and photos of me and us spread out all over the bed. In the living room, they found a suicide letter that was several pages long. In it, she spoke about my death and how it couldn't be helped. I was in shock, so the cop had to spell it out for me. She had every intention of ending you, and then herself. You did the right thing by not coming here. She continues stalking me online, and when I block her on all social media platforms, she starts sending threat texts. I answered long enough to tell her that if she doesn't leave me alone, I'd fill in a restraining order. This kept her away for a while, until she showed up at a venue I was working at and tried to attack me. Big thanks to the quick reflexes of the security guard on site for keeping me safe that night. The next day, she acted like nothing had happened. I filed the restraining order and wasted 6 months of my time dealing with courts, only to have a judge dismiss the case as a lady spat. The stalking eventually stopped, but I was always on high alert. Even today, the sight of a magenta/fire hydrant red dye makes my skin crawl. I had a teacher who had a very interesting Ouija board story. This teacher joked around and wasn't really ever serious, but was funny as hell and an overall good teacher. But when Ouija boards came up, she got extremely serious and shared a bone-chilling story. She had some friends over one weekend and they got bored and decided to break out the good old household Ouija board. They had asked questions and got weird vibes from some of the answers that they received, but pushed forward. Finally, someone asked when they were going to die, and it went around the circle and everyone got a decent number in their 80s or 70s. But one girl got the age 19. Granted, they were juniors/seniors in high school, so that was only a few years away. A few years go by, and the girl who got 19 as the age of death was killed by a car while walking on a beach, while on spring break. Her friend she was with broke her leg or something. She was 19, just a week away from turning 20. The nature of the death and the fact that she was close to her 20th birthday makes it so scary because she was so close to defying the Ouija board. Never ever doing it. Needless to say, I'm too terrified to get answers like that. At the time of this story, I was 14 years old and living in Germany with my mother, father, brother and a dog. My family and I are British, but we'd been living in Germany for a few years at this point due to my father's work. It was great. We had an awesome house, lots of friends, and the going was good. To make it even more amazing, my parents were wrapping up the sale of our old house in the UK, which had been on the market for what felt like forever, and selling it from overseas had just become a massive headache for my parents. The closing of this house sale would not only allow my parents to finally relax, but it was going to pay for the holiday of a lifetime. I'm talking white sand, crystal clear blue oceans, elephant rides, staying in a cabin on the beach, the whole 9 yards. Finally, the offer had been made, the paperwork printed and signed, and to say we were excited was an understatement. This must have been around summertime, as I remember we were due to start back at school in a few weeks. So rather than waiting another 12 months before the next summer break, we planned the holiday for the Christmas period instead. No cold, snow or freezing wind for us. A short time passed and I came home one day and my brother and I knew something bad had happened. My dad had come home early from work. There were many phone calls being made and my mother looked absolutely furious. "What happened?" I asked Mum, hoping to God I wasn't in trouble. "He pulled out," my mother stormed as she slammed the pots down to get dinner ready. The bloody actually pulled out of buying the house. Can you believe it? "What? No!" my brother and I both exclaimed. Yes, so after signing everything, he then has the cheek to ask us to drop the asking price about 5k. I don't bloody think so. He can forget it. My mother calmed down after a bit and sadly told us that it would mean no exotic holiday. We had to stay home instead. We reassured her it was fine despite feeling incredibly disappointed. My brother was 8 at the time and we were really close, so we'd already planned all these amazing activities that we were going to do while we were out there. So sadly the sale was called off and we stayed home for Christmas. The year, however, was 2004. And our destination? The coastline of Sri Lanka. I woke up that Boxing Day only to be greeted by the horror of the most destructive and deadly tsunami in living memory. The coastline, the homes and businesses, and almost 250,000 people just suddenly wiped away in the blink of an eye. I was glued to the TV for most of that day, too horrified to look away, just watching the death toll rise and rise. Newscasters kept showing the before and after photos, and I recognized the wooden cabins we wanted to stay at. We never would have stood a chance. I'm 29 now, and to this day still carry an enormous sense of guilt, and I try to avoid talking about it whenever weird events come up in conversation. So to the bloke who messed up our house deal and ruined our family holiday, thank you for saving our lives. I work on an adult oncology unit, where unfortunately we have a lot of comfort care patients. The majority of them transition to hospice, where they live out their final days. Sometimes they don't quite make it and pass away while they're still in the hospital. We have the most deaths in the hospital in our unit, and a lot of floats don't like coming up to our floor because everyone dies. We all love it though, and wouldn't have it any other way. There's so much love between the nurses and our patients. We get to know them really well. When people pass away, we have noticed that, unsurprisingly, it comes in threes. We will go a few weeks with no one passing away. Everyone successfully makes it out of there and goes home or to a hospice or a TCU or wherever they go to pass on, only to have a week or two where we will have 3 to 6 deaths a week. One week we had 2 patients pass away in one night. One of the patients was Imra Mate. She was really near and dear to our hearts, and it was a rough time for everyone involved. She had been on the floor for a prolonged period of time, and we all watched her go from a spry old lady to basically wasting away in all aspects. She passed on nights, and by the next day there was a new patient in her room. It's hard on all of us, but as we all know, patients come and go, and we have to move on. I was doing the admission with the new patient and going over room orientation stuff. I explained that she had a one-stop shop remote which controlled the lights, TV, radio, and had the cool light. Right as I finished explaining to her that the TV buttons are right here, I set the remote down on her bed and instantly the TV turned on by itself. It began flipping through each channel at an alarming rate, faster than if you were to hold down the channel up button. She was a little older and thankfully not too observant, and I thought I was doing it, but no one was touching the remote. She says, "No thank you, I don't want to watch TV right now." So I reached down and tried to turn it off. It didn't switch off. I ended up panicking a bit inside and yanking the remote out the wall and telling her that it seemed not to be working properly and that I would get her a new one. The TV still wouldn't turn off after I unplugged the remote from the wall, and normally it would be all connected and not work if it wasn't plugged in properly. I ended up having to walk and manually shut the TV off. I headed out of there, telling her I'd be right back, and as I went to the nurse's desk to grab another one, I ran into another nurse. She was grabbing another remote, which was odd. We just got a new shipment in, and they were all normally working properly. We rarely had to replace them anymore, and I asked her if her remote was broken too, and she said that hers was acting up. I asked her which room she was in, and it was another room that a patient had passed in the night before also. The TV remotes were uncharacteristically acting up from across the wing at the same time, in the same rooms that people had died the night before. Freaky. I could ramble forever, but most stories are related to the TV. I had another situation similar to the one I just described, where the volume was going up and down by itself in a room where a patient had passed on recently. I've seen lights not work and then work again. I have even seen a sink turn on when there was no one else around. We have several designated rooms that are reserved for our comfort patients, and even when they are unoccupied, we will walk by them and it feels like someone is there. But when we look, it's clearly empty. We've had a room where IV pumps stopped working and BP machines quit on us, and nothing seems to work. But that room got cleansed by a healing touch volunteer, which I know sounds crazy, but now everything in the room works just fine. But that's a story for another day. I've never been a huge believer in the supernatural, but after working in this unit for the past year, it's not hard to believe in the paranormal. We all just embrace it because what can you do, really? Around 4 years ago when I was 13, me and my family went on a vacation to Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. We had gone there several times in the past since it was usually low priced and a nice way to get away from our cold Canadian winters. We were staying at an all-inclusive resort near the ocean. This resort had a lot of things to do during the night, like shows and whatnot. 3 days into our trip, my family went to go see a show. We were all having a fun time, until I started to get a really bad headache, and my parents noticed this, telling me that I should lie down in our room. I agreed and they handed me a key card. As I was walking into the elevator, a tall Hispanic man walked in with me. He was wearing what seemed to be a dirty jacket and ripped jeans, and also had a big, dark beard that was uncombed and looked very frizzy. I pushed the button for the 7th floor, and he just stood still, leading me to think his room was there too. He then started asking me questions like how old I was, and how long was I staying there. I answered normally, but then he asked where the rest of my family was. My answer was one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. I responded with, watching the show downstairs, and as I got off, he started following me down the hallway, which I started sweating and freaking out over. As I was approaching my room, I kind of squeaked and asked, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Back to my room." Now shaking as I put the key card in the door lock, he seemed to be turning around, facing the other room across from me. As soon as the door opened, he turned and charged at me. Because I was looking back, I saw him, ran into the room, and tried shutting the door, but he got to it first. Now it was me and him alone in the hotel room. He had what looked to be a knife or shank, and he was slowly walking towards me and said, "Be quiet, or I'll kill you." As I was in the back of the room, he was getting closer, and I threw the lamp at him and rushed to get around and out the room. He cut my arm pretty deep, but I was sprinting out the room to get to the stairwell. As I got to the lobby, I ran to my family, crying and screaming for help. After that, I got stitches on my arm, and my mum still doesn't forgive herself for not coming with me to the room. The hotel offered us an upgrade to the nice suite, and we took it, but were very paranoid for the rest of the trip. We later found out he was a homeless man that just came through the doors of the hotel. He stole my laptop and my backpack, which were in the open, and then fled to the lobby and out the doors. I have a story to tell that my mum told me a while back. It was her experience with a Ouija board, and my mum wouldn't make something like this up. The whole reason she even told me about it was because I brought up the idea of using one to contact a younger brother who passed away. Anyway, her story freaked me out enough to never use one. Back when she was in high school late one night, her and a group of her friends were cruising around on gravel roads a few miles outside of town, as I live in a small town in Iowa, and they stopped at an old abandoned barn and decided to whip out an old Ouija board one of her friends had. My mum had a really bad feeling right off the bat and said she wasn't going to do it. Well, everyone kept calling her a sissy and saying it wouldn't work unless everyone was there. So my mom was convinced, but only on one condition. She'd play if they didn't ask sketchy questions. Some of the guys laughed and promised not to. So they all gathered around the floor of the barn and placed their hands on the slider of the board. They asked some basic questions about it. Is there anyone here? What's your name? Things like that. But there was no response. Then a guy called Terry asked, which one of us will be the first to die? And my mum pulled her hands off the board and said, that's not funny. She was super pissed and everyone screamed at her to put her hand back on the board. As soon as she put her hand back on, the piece moved and spelled out the initials of a boy who was there. CJ. He was a twin. His twin was also present. And after that they said their goodbyes because they were all freaked out and my mum was pissed. And everyone was blaming each other for moving the piece on the board. So anyway, they all went home and basically forgot about the whole thing. Years later, that CJ was out driving on a gravel road and he ended up crashing into the ditch and lost his life. The first one out of everyone there. And the creepy thing is that when the police were done investigating the crash, they said the tire flew off because someone purposely loosened the lug nuts on the tire. So, ever since she told me that story, I've been too scared of trying the board. This was a few years ago, on a night scuba dive. There were 8 of us in the group, including our dive master and his assistant. We had just finished our dive, and were gathered up in a circle ready to ascend and get out of the water, when my dive master freezes. He takes his flashlight, and pointing it outside our circle of divers, he catches something circling us with the beam. Turns out, it was a 12-foot-long great white shark. At this point, half the group are trying to keep the shark illuminated as it circles us, and remarkably everyone stayed calm. The only thing that went through my mind were iterations of those 2 thoughts. Don't look like a yummy, delicious, fatty seal, and that I hope I taste terrible. My dive master gets our attention and slowly puts his thumb up, and then makes an upwards motion with all of us beginning to ascend, and the shark kept with us until we were maybe 10 feet from the surface. Then it turned off into the darkness and was gone. I did not go back into the ocean for about a week after that. I work as an elderly care worker down in the southwest of Australia. I love my job and love all my residents who I look after and gain real cool friendships with. Sometime in early 2018, one of my favorite residents was put on palliative care, end-of-life care, which we look after more intensely, making sure they're the most comfortable they can be before they pass. I was able to spend a good amount of time of my shift being able to care for her in her final moments. As my shift ended, I got to say a last goodbye before I clocked off and went home to sleep. That night I had a dream where I was with my friends at the beach, and we were running down the stairs to head to the water, where I turned my head to the left and find the resident who I looked after sitting there staring at the ocean with just a blank look on her face. I walk up in front of her and greet her, asking if she was feeling okay. I remembered in my dream that she was meant to be in strict palliative care, to which she replied, No, I don't think I am. I kinda nodded to her and hoped that she'd feel better real soon, while I kind of wanted to wake up at that point. But the freaky part was when I woke up into another dream where I was lying on my stomach in my room, in my bed, where I was experiencing a sleep paralysis, and I hear behind me, you guessed it, a little old lady's voice telling me, Victoria is dead, right? You know she was hurt, right? Shortly after hearing that, I feel 2 hands push on my body as if they were trying to push me out of bed, at which point I woke up in the early morning around 4 a.m, heavy breathing and just straight up quite shaken. After going back to sleep and waking up in the morning and heading to work, I found out that the little old lady had passed away at the same time I woke up from my sleep paralysis. I've told this story to a few friends to freak them out, but I've never actually looked up details on this sort of thing happening. Call it paranormal or coincidence. I'm still not quite sure. It has taken me a while to even get up the nerve to write this story, even though these incidents happened more than a decade ago. I was never very popular in school with members of the opposite sex. I didn't even have those cute elementary school boyfriends. At the time, I was overweight and thought I just must be hideously ugly. But now I realize it was simply because I was shy, quiet, and had no confidence. In truth, I was quite pretty despite being a little chubby. I didn't know this back then though. My self-esteem was so low, you would have had to scrape it off the ground with a spatula. On top of that, my home life was horrible. My parents were both alcoholics and drug addicts. I say all of this not to drum up any sympathy, but simply to show you that I had no supportive or sane person in the coming months to lean upon, which might explain why things got as bad as they did. I was a junior in high school when I first met him, Jay. He sat across from me in a certain class, and I was instantly attracted to him. I did what I always did when I had a crush on a boy. I watched him. Sometimes he would catch me looking at him, and one time he gave me a small smile. That smile gave me the courage to actually talk to him, and at some point we agreed to go have lunch together. This was probably 2 weeks after the smile. No romantic gestures were made, but we became good friends and began going to lunch together every day. Our school allowed us to go off campus, and we had a full hour, and we both had a car, so we would just drive around and talk. As the weeks wore on, my other friends began complaining that I never went to lunch with them anymore, and in truth, I did miss hanging out with them too. So I told Jay I was going to spend some time with my friends. He was so angry, hurt, and disappointed that I agreed I would only go to lunch with my friends on Thursdays. The rest of the week we would be together. We were not even dating at this point, and I found his clinginess off-putting, so my initial crush quickly faded away. In my mind, we were only just friends, and I was perfectly fine with that. My friends thought it was so weird that I had to make a deal with him just so that I could hang out with them. And looking back, I see this was totally ridiculous, and I should have cut ties with him right there and then. But as I said, he was the only boy who had ever shown an interest in me, even just as a friend, and I didn't want to give that up. The attention felt good. In the spring, just as I was starting to feel the relief of my crush for Jay ending, he unexpectedly asked me to go to the prom. He was a senior, so this was his only chance to go. I had never been to a prom or on a date, so I said yes, thinking it would be fun. It was actually a wonderful evening. I had never felt so beautiful in my whole life. I was kind of caught up in this magical Cinderella type feeling. So when Jay leaned in to kiss me, I kissed him back. It was my first kiss and it was sweet, even though so many of my memories with Jay are awful. After that kiss I was floating. It truly is a happy memory for me despite all that eventually happened. My crush for Jay had ended, but the kiss had been wonderful, and I had never had a boyfriend before, so even though I wasn't 100% into him anymore, I quickly agreed to be his girlfriend. After that, everything changed. Jay instantly became 10,000 times more clingier than he had been before. He said he loved me 2 days after kissing me. I didn't want to say it back because I didn't love him, but he pressured me into saying it by making me feel guilty. I guess I should have just said this earlier, but I have a huge heart and hate hurting anyone's feelings, so I often find myself just going along with things to make the situations and others happy. That's what happened with Jay. Over time, I even convinced myself that I really did love him. After I became Jay's girlfriend, it was like I belonged to him. I still had permission to go grab lunch with my friends once a week, but they were always complaining about how clingy he was with me. I thought it was sweet. I couldn't believe a boy liked me this much. It did wonders for my self-image. After school let out, it would soon become apparent that I would be expected to spend every single day of that summer with Jay, and I was also the one who had to drive to his place and then all around town whenever we wanted to go, since I had a better car. Now, I realize he was just a lazy douchebag, but back then I justified the wasted gasoline, for which he never paid me back. We spent a lot of time at Jay's house because I hated being home with my own family, given the situation. I need to describe the place as it's important. The first time I saw the house that Jay lived in with his parents, I honestly thought a bomb had gone off. There was stuff piled everywhere. If you've ever seen the show Hoarders, it was like that. Jay told me that his mum used to clean, but she became so upset that he and his father never helped her, and that just one day she stopped, just like that. And the result was this horrifically chaotic crowded house that had been accumulating this mess for years. One day there was this stomach-churning smell, and we had to go hunting for it, and finally found this grocery bag under a pile of crap. Whatever was in it had liquefied. I mean, this place was so disgusting, and the fact that Jay and his father were willing to live like that just so that they didn't have to clean should have told me to run the hell away. Jay's father did nothing but smoke and watch TV all day. He was this hugely obese, gruff type of guy who acknowledged my presence only with a nod of his head. In contrast, Jay's mother was sweet, but spent all her time in the back room, which I later learned she was doing as she was in the process of separating from her husband. They no longer shared a room or even spoke to each other. I was to find out a very dark truth about their marriage later on. Anyway, as time went on, Jay began to pressure me into sleeping with him. I didn't love him and didn't want to lose my virginity to someone I wasn't that into, so I always brushed it off. Things were darkening in our relationship by the time school started back up in the fall. I was a senior that year, and Jay was taking classes at a local community college, so at least I had some freedom from him, though he still met me for lunch frequently. That winter, to get out the house and also to have some pocket money, I got my first job at a fast food place. Jay was instantly upset with me because he wouldn't get to see me as much, so he applied for the same place. He did not get the job, but he frequently came by during my shifts to check up on me because he didn't want me meeting or talking to other guys. He was particularly hateful of my male co-workers because we all liked to joke around and have a good time. I didn't realize at the time how weird this all was. I truly thought it was sweet that he was so into me and was so jealous and protective. Jay increased the pressure on me to sleep with him until it was almost unbearable. But I can be a stubborn hard-ass when I really believe in something, and I just refused to give in, even though by then he would openly get angry about it with me. Over time, he pressured me into letting him fill me up. Though I told him he wasn't allowed to look, he did anyway. He also touched me somewhere inappropriately without my consent, which humiliated me. In fact, that was all I felt when he touched me intimately, humiliated and degraded. I began to secretly loathe him, and became more determined than ever that I would in my whole life never give him my virginity, even if he were the last man on earth and the human race depended on our procreation, even if it killed me. He began to disgust me, and I resented the time I didn't get to spend with my friends. I was pissed about using all the gas in my car to drive him around, and I was sick of his clinginess. It was no longer cute nor endearing. I wanted to end the relationship, but shockingly I still didn't want to hurt his feelings. That spring I began studying domestic violence for a project, and that's when all the pieces fell together. My relationship with Jay had almost every single sign of an abusive relationship, and I was absolutely gutted. At that point I began to seriously think about how I was going to get out of this. I began to call the domestic violence hotline, and they talked some sense into me, validating what I already knew to be true. Meanwhile, Jay was getting creepier and crazier. He got a job at the same telemarketing place as I did, and he began to match my shifts so that he could sit right next to me and take calls. He got so mad when I talked to any guy, even old guys. Sometimes he would find pictures of me with guy friends from the past and would demand to know who they were and why I was with them. He also began making veiled comments and threats about taking my virginity, with or without my consent. Once he said he'd be so pissed off if someone else touched me because he didn't want another guy getting to me first. He later denied this, but I know what I heard. One of the scariest things he ever told me was that once he was walking through his neighborhood and saw a front door of a house wide open. He walked into this stranger's house and a girl was there taking a shower. He told me he could barely keep himself from going up to her, and it was the closest he'd ever come to doing something horrific to a woman. I didn't realize at the time that he was telling me this not as a story or as a confession, but as a thinly veiled threat to me. Then the bombshell came. Now that Jay was old enough to move out, his mother decided to finalize the divorce. She had stayed with his father for his sake, and he was an only child. That day she sat down with him and told him the truth about his birth. His father had sexually assaulted her while she was asleep and gotten her pregnant, and that's how he was conceived. She woke up midway through the attack. Her parents, who I guess were religious nuts, pushed her to get married. This news understandably devastated Jay, and I honestly think it pushed him over some kind of an edge that he had been getting close to all his life. I tried to be there for him as much as I could, and I truly felt compassion. I mean, what a horrible weight to carry on your shoulders. His mother had lived a miserable existence with her rapist, all for his sake. It's actually heartbreaking. I felt so sorry for him and for his mother. No wonder she didn't want to clean for that disgusting excuse of a man. That spring she moved into her own apartment and Jay moved in with her. He rarely spoke to his father after that. And the man later died, probably from his unhealthy habits. Before the move happened though, I tried to break up with Jay. Things had gotten so crazy and so intense that I was scared. Jay was still threatening me. He was so frustrated with me that he was punching walls, kicking a dent into his car and throwing things, cutting himself in front of me and the like. It was classic intimidation tactics that abusers use to cow their victims, and it worked on me. However, I still had enough sense from the volunteers at the domestic violence hotline to try and get away. I would call them from payphones during the school day, too scared to use my cell phone for fear of anyone finding out. I was so incredibly alone. No one knew, and I'm sure if I were a different girl with a weaker personality, this relationship would have ended my life one way or another. The night I tried to leave Jay, we were at his father's house. His father was doing his usual routine of smoking and watching TV. I tried to let Jay down as gently as I could, saying it was me and not him, but he flew into a rage. When I tried to leave the room, he grabbed me, pulled me back onto the bed, which was the first and only time he physically assaulted me. His father heard me call out and ask if I was okay, and I saw that as my out. I hurried out of the house and spent the loneliest moments of my entire life sitting in my car next to the curb, sobbing and wondering where I should go. I knew my parents were drunk and wouldn't even care, and now that Jay had so effectively isolated me, I now had no friends. That was one of the darkest moments in my life, and I'll never forget it. I eventually called an old friend of mine who I hadn't spoken to in months, explained the situation and asked to spend the night. She became one of my closest and dearest friends after that, and was my maid of honor in my wedding. But I digress. That night was a turning point in our relationship for sure. Jay tried everything to get me back, even calling from the phones of our mutual friends to trick me into answering. He also began to drive slowly past my house all the time. It seemed that every time I looked out the window, there he was driving by, staring at the house. This happened so frequently, I can only assume he drove past the place at least once an hour. He would leave gifts on the porch and told me how heartbroken he was, and how he would change and never do anything to hurt me again. That's why I went back to him. I know, I was stupid. It was illogical, inconceivable, but I did. I had classic battered woman syndrome. I was isolated, had no self-esteem, and no support. Over the next year, we would be together a few months, then something scary would happen and I would leave him, and the cycle would start over. I was miserable. During that time, he got arrested for walking around with a huge knife he'd gotten from a weapon shop. Someone had seen him walking around in their neighborhood and called the cops. Why he was walking in some random neighborhood with that, I don't know. But when I talk about the story, he told me about the girl showering. I get sick thinking of the possibilities. We continued on this half-relationship state until my second year of college, when I finally found the courage to completely cut him off. For a long time after that, he continued to stalk me, driving through my neighborhood, appearing at places I was. He did not let up until I met my now husband, David, who vowed to absolutely end this guy if he even saw him. And while I didn't tell this to Jay directly, I said enough that he got the message. David was the opposite end of Jay. And I want to end this story on a happy note because we are still together 11 years later, happily married with a 1-year-old son. We live in a completely different state now. A couple of my family members have even run into Jay over the years, and creepily enough, he claims not to remember me. I'm not sure if he's married, but I hope he isn't. If he is, his wife is in hell. This is where I leave this story. Hopefully it will help another girl avoid the traps I fell into. When I was 13, I lived in a small town in rural Zimbabwe. We had a large, single-story house with a massive garden that surrounded the property. On one side of the house, the garden narrowed between our house and the fence of the neighbor's house. At the end of this narrow section was an empty, decrepit, cement-lined pond that I had recently cleared of rubble and plant life with the plan of eventually filling it again. One afternoon, my friend Dan and I were messing around in the garden, and for some reason I found myself running down the narrowed section of garden straight towards the pond. Suddenly, for some reason that I can't really articulate, dread and fear washed over my body like 1,000 needles raining down from the sky. I stopped dead in my tracks about 2 meters from the pond and found myself breathlessly staring at it motionlessly. From the crack on one side of the pond, a long snake, perhaps a meter long, emerged 3 or 4 seconds later. It was a Mozambique spitting cobra, a large, aggressive, and extremely venomous snake that wouldn't hesitate to bite or spit at threats. Like a 13-year-old boy running past its new home in the wall of the pond, for instance. I slowly backed away, and the pond was filled with sand the next day. To this day, I don't know what it was that stopped me dead in my tracks, but if I continued, perhaps I wouldn't be here today. This is a story which I took a while to find out about from my parents. My family consists of my mum, dad, big sister and I. We were on holiday at a big family-style resort in the 90s. For context, this happened somewhere in a South American country. I've told this story many times, but don't want to dox myself by giving away too many details. For context, I have no recollections of the event, but I do remember parts of the holiday. The sea, the white sand, and banana trees. The 4 of us were staying at one of those classic family hotels, the ones where the buffet have eggs, bacon, fresh fruits, and pancakes galore. The type where there are also lots of kids and a lot of animation for them. There was a kids club where I would go, and I remember making a friend there too, a little boy my age. That's all I remember. And the rest is from my dad recounting this. We were at the hotel playing area, my parents and I. A woman working for the hotel and part of the kids club animation team were playing with me. I was a cute, shy little blonde kid, and she started playing with me and talking to me. My parents relaxed, enjoying their holiday knowing that their daughter is being entertained by the kids club staff. all good, until my dad turns around and sees that I'm missing. I'm not next to them, and the woman playing with me was also nowhere in sight. With Papa Bear reflexes, my dad stands up to see the woman is walking slowly but surely across the hotel with his daughter in her arms. He begins chasing her down the hotel, and she takes up some speed, beginning to run with me in her arms. This was a vast hotel complex, so there was a long way to go. My dad says he ran after her through doors which would then close in his face. By a stroke of luck, he managed to catch up with her just before she made it to the side exit and pulled me out of her hands. In shock, he grabbed me and ran back, letting the woman disappear into a forest. Immediately, my parents went to the hotel to complain and let them know that either their staff or somebody pretending to be their staff tried to take me. The hotel brushed this off casually and said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This happens sometimes." I hope this hotel has changed since the 90s, but it really makes me think how messed up is it that the hotel didn't give a single damn that someone was almost taken on their watch, and it's almost like they were in on it somehow. I was a nurse for 7 years. In my entire career, I worked at a single facility. The facility had many renovations done during the years as it opened in 1960. By 2011, when I started working there, only half the facility was the original building, and the rest had all been added over the years. I worked nights, mostly because I'm a night owl and found it easier than morning work. I had a number of odd experiences, but I'll share the main ones that stick with me. Firstly, I had experiences with the supernatural since the age of 3, so I believe in the supernatural, but wasn't obsessed, more aware, if that makes sense. There was one wing in particular that was part of the original building, which had a small sitting room and a television for residents to enjoy during the day. During my night shifts, this one area gave me such a feeling of dread and fear that I would only be near it for as long as I had to. I would go out of my way and take the long way back to the nurse's station just to avoid being near it. Nothing I knew ever happened there, but my gut feeling was screaming at me that there was something there, and it was not happy. This feeling eased during daylight, but once it was night, the feeling was there. It felt as if someone was watching me, and they didn't like the fact that I was there. I spoke to a few other nurses about this, and they all claimed they experienced the same feeling. One other experience sticks out to me. A 90-year-old woman called Jane went to breakfast, then asked to be taken back to her room for a sleep. She was a very healthy woman, but she said she wasn't feeling well. When the nurse did her next round 20 minutes later, they found that the resident had passed away in her sleep. I found out it was an aortic aneurysm, so she didn't suffer. Unfortunately, death is rarely quick in aged care, so usually a slow process of days or weeks. Jane was a very sweet Polish lady. She had outlived her children, and her husband had passed many years ago, so she never had visitors. I would check on her and bring her tea at exactly 9:30 p.m. and say goodnight. As you could probably guess, not everything goes to schedule in healthcare, and it was not always possible to stick to a strict routine. But if it got to 9:35, she would ring her call bell and ask for her tea, then apologize profusely for ringing her bell, and every time I answered with, "Whenever you need help, press the button, it's not trouble, I love to help." She would then say her usual, "Good night, sweet girl," and I'd leave and get on with my shift. The funeral home was late to pick her up, and I helped the undertaker in the afternoon when my shift started. All the rooms had a call bell next to the toilet, one next to the bed, and the resident wore a necklace or bracelet with a call bell attached to it. When a resident passes, their room call bells are disconnected the same day, and the personal bell is put in the nurse's station ready for the next person to move in. At 9:36, the call bell went to her room started ringing again. This wasn't possible. Her room had been disconnected, and her personal bell was sitting in a drawer next to me. Slightly freaked, I went down to her room and checked to make sure there wasn't a dementia patient who just wandered in there. Maybe maintenance hadn't turned the bell off, even though I personally spoke to them after they did so. It was just trying to rationalize it, I suppose. I went into the room and it was pitch black. No one was inside and the bell had definitely been turned off, and I was unable to turn it off from inside the room, so I had to cancel it from the main desk. I instantly had a feeling of peace. Weird, because in every other situation I would have been a mess. I think perhaps she was just saying goodbye. As I was closing the door to her room, I heard a shriek, and my best friend came running down the corridor crying in a state. Once I got her to calm down, she said she was in the other wing chatting to Jane as she walked past her in her nightie, and she turned the corner to the front wing, but when she looked around the corner she wasn't there. She's dead. What the hell did she just see? I've gone back and forth with the idea of sharing this for a while. After searching through a lot of places on the internet, this seems like the best place to discuss them. I still have my reservations though. In any case, I am looking for answers. Several years ago I was doing my undergraduate studies at a large university in Pennsylvania. This event happened in 2005. I was dating a girl called Erin at the time who was big into New Age ideas, paganism, magic, and the like. And I did learn some cool stuff from her too. Eventually I met some of her like-minded friends, and in our conversations it came up that one of the rooms in the oldest building on campus caused two of them, a guy and a girl who were dating, to experience a lot of psychic distress. Kyle had gotten nosebleeds in the classroom, and Julie often grew disoriented or frightened when she was there. Someone in our group had the bright idea to sneak up there one night, and of course we all went for it. It was me, Kyle, Julie, Erin, and a medium named Audra and her friend Sharon, and another girl called Kesha. Sharon and Kesha, like me, had a lot of supernatural experiences in the past, but didn't consider themselves mediums or sensitive or anything. So one night we bought a novelty Ouija board from Walmart, a glow-in-the-dark one because why not, and started doing our thing. At first the planchette didn't do anything, but then it started twitching and eventually it was whipping around choosing letters that made no sense to any of us. Until afterwards, as Kyle was writing down the letters. Then out of nowhere, Audra started mini convulsions. I don't know how else to describe it. Her eyes rolled up and she started spasming and making these horrific pig noises. Not just snorting or squealing, but belting those noises out like I never thought a human would be able to make. She started crawling her way to the door. The planchette was going crazy, and when Kyle jumped to her to keep her from heading towards the stairs which were directly across the hall, we all kind of snapped out of it. Audra was a small, slim girl, but it took 3 or 4 of us to keep her from leaving the room, and all the while there were still horrible noises coming from her, and we all had this incredible sense of danger and foreboding. There wasn't a terrible smell or anything like you read sometimes, but it was terrifying. Not to be anticlimactic, but after that we packed everything up, went back to my apartment over a crappy pizza shop, and stayed huddled together for quite a while. I swear I threw the Ouija board out, but years later I would find it under my bed at a parent's house when I was packing up to move. Seriously, any thoughts or experiences similar, or general comments would be great. I work as an engineer in a data center cooling plant. We're responsible for basically everything in the building: mechanical, electrical, HVAC, plumbing. So the engineer I'm relieving tells me there's an odd sound coming from the Con Ed vaults. This is where huge transformers are that step down the 26,000 volts or so to a voltage the building can actually use. We're not allowed in those vaults. They're locked and only Con Ed has the keys. So he leaves and I take a walk by the vaults. I had never actually heard electricity arcing through the air before, but I knew I was hearing it then. I called Con Ed's emergency line and told them to get out there ASAP. A crew of 2 guys showed up. They seemed calm and disinterested in the elevator all the way up. "It's probably just a contact chattering," they said. We got off the elevator and they start heading down the hall. The sound was way louder now. We weren't even near the vaults and there was no mistaking it. Both guys stopped dead in their tracks and kind of hunkered down. I saw the color drain from them. I wasted no time getting back in the elevator. If you've never seen a video of a large transformer explosion, go to YouTube. These transformers are not like the ones you see up on utility poles. They're as big as a couple of trucks stacked on top of each other. Anyone on the floor, when one of them cooked off, would be gone. And we have 8 of them. Eventually, the con guys got in, but not before cutting the power to the entire building. They called in right away, cut the power, then a bunch of more con ed guys showed up to check out the damage. Apparently there's a conductor at the top of these transformer called a hammerhead. The insulation had burnt right off, and it just got worse from there. Everyone in the utility was glad we caught it when we did. I was on a date in Camden with a girl who from photos I wasn't overly excited about meeting, but in the flesh made my eyebrows shoot off my head. She was really pretty and smart and funny. We had quite a few cocktails, and I think we were in the Blues Kitchen before going to the gay bar in Camden, which I think has since closed down. I think it was called the Black Cap. The date was going well and we met these people who join our table, and the guy tells me at the bar that my date said she wanted me to kiss her. I did, and it turned out the guy was just helping us by moving things along. My date was really shocked and told me I was bold, but she liked it. She came back to my hotel room with me, which was a 10-minute walk away. The room was kind of small but cool and space agent style. We were both drunk and made out a lot. Then she started crying about problems she was having with a friend who was really sick and her job was really stressful. Full-on sobbing. She left in embarrassment, even though I was worried about her leaving like that. She said she would be okay. As she left, I saw a large man in a black, thick leather jacket in the corridor. He was staring at my date as she left, and then stared at me as I closed the door. I was pretty wasted, so after checking my date got on the bus, I had a nap and was awoken by banging at the door. I ignored it, but then it kept going on, so I got up and staggered to the door and opened it a crack. I recognized the leather elbow and arm as the door was shoved violently open. I was drunk, and the jolt of the door caused me to fall over. Luckily, the room entrance was small and around the width of the door, so my back was against the wall by the door while my feet touched the other wall. My body kept the door closed as this man kept shoving against it. I managed to get the door closed again, locked it and went to sleep as I was still drunk. When I woke up in the morning, I thought I had dreamt the whole thing about the man and the door. But when I looked down at my side, my ribs, hips and thigh had dark bruises. I was really lucky and I'm so glad the room was tight on space, because if it hadn't been, the guy would have got in pretty easily. So creepy leather-clad man who tried to break into my hotel room, let's not meet. I just want to add I'm female, of average height, average body weight, and have really beady arms. I work in a rural mental health center in my hometown. This happened about a year after I started working there. I was also going to college full-time and only going to work part-time. I worked at the front desk at the time, and there was one particular client who took a liking to me. This guy had done a lot of meth in his day and basically fried his brain. He had drug-induced schizophrenia and is also really into conspiracy theories. At some point, we spoke while he was checking in, and he found out my mum's last name through that conversation. We have a different last name due to my parents' divorce, but for the life of me, I can't ever remember giving that personal information to a client. But it could have just been that he knew who my family was, since this was a rather small town. and basically everyone knows everyone. Not to mention my family owns a pretty large business in our town. But he remembers me telling him, so really who knows. About a month or two after, he started calling, 2 or 3 times a day, for me. Keep in mind I'm not a clinician. I don't have any one client to talk to, so it's weird for a client to ask for me. But he would only call when I was in class or on PTO days. One day his clinician pulled me aside and told me he was concerned for my safety because of this client. The client had come in for an appointment and told his therapist that he had a premonition about me. Something bad was going to happen to me, and he was going to be the one who saved me. Apparently one night, while they were watching his regular unsolved crime shows, he ran across a story about Leah Rochelle Pebble, who just so happens to have gone missing in the same state I live in, and shares my last name, and her middle name is similar to my first. On top of that, my co-worker named AJ and Leah had a pimp named AJ. He had gotten it into his head that I was Leah and that I had been taken by my family and my co-workers and brainwashed into thinking who I now was, and as a result lost all the memories from my previous life. He was determined to save me and return me to my correct family. After that, I started noticing his car around pretty much wherever I went. He stalked my Facebook and messaged all the family members I had listed and my top friends. Luckily, I had told these people about this guy and not to engage with him. When he didn't get a reply, he wouldn't push it, except with my mum, who also worked in the facility. I worked just in IT. He would message her daily asking about me, asking why she took me and if she felt bad. I had to be walked in and out of work for about 6 months after, and I couldn't go anywhere in public alone. I think he dropped it eventually. I'm still not allowed to be up front when he's coming in, and occasionally still see his car drive by my house every once in a while, which is even creepier because I've moved twice since then. This was around 2007-2008. I was about 12 at the time, and me and my dad were heading up to Cape York. It was a good few days' drive to Cairns from where we lived in Bundaberg, Queensland, and we were in no rush. We finally got into Cairns at around 10:30 p.m. We were both really excited to cross the Daintree River and really start the adventure. It was decided that we would hang out at my uncle's place for a few days, as we didn't see him often. My uncle is a dead-set straight out of the 70s, Lennon glasses wearing pot-smoking hippie musician guys. He also loved fishing, and his favourite place to go was the Daintree. Anyway, the morning rolls around and we head out to launch the boat at around 6 a.m. and fish away for most of the day. Didn't catch anything, but we were kept entertained by my uncle telling us all his stories. As the sun is beginning to set, we head over this little spit of white sand way over the side of the river. My uncle was dead set that he could find his way back in the dark, so we hung about on the little private beach talking, drinking and cooking a lamb roast in the campfire oven. Now for those of you who don't know, the Daintree has a bit of a lizard problem. And when I say lizards, I mean huge ass crocodiles that will mess you up 8 ways to Sunday. My uncle is adamant that they don't come this far out, as the water starts getting a bit cold for them, so we aren't too worried. So as we're sitting there, we notice that my uncle isn't doing much talking, he's just kind of sitting and listening. We ask him what's up, and he sort of motions us to shut up. We don't really hear much at all, but he's got the both of us pretty spooked. All of a sudden he jumps up and runs as fast as you'd please to the tinny and grabs this big long bamboo spear thing. One of us had to ask him earlier in the day what it was for, and he said he keeps it around in case crocs got too close. He could give them a jab from the boat and they'd swim away and leave him be. Well, he takes a few steps off into the dark, jabs into this patch of mangroves with this long-ass bamboo pokey stick, and me and my dad just about died when we hear this big scaly thing take off into the water at 50 miles an hour. We noped out of there without finishing our roast. chills my blood to know that thing was a few feet away from us while we were having a good time. If any of us would have walked off in that direction for a slash, we'd have been chomped for sure. I tried to contact a paranormal entity, and some not so fun things happened. So this is the time my friends and I decided to be extra dumb. And I say this because I want all of those listening to understand that I, as well as my friends, now fully understand how stupid we were being. The important backstory for this location, Proctor Valley. Proctor Valley is in San Diego County and connects the towns of Otay and Jamal. It is protected and is a wildlife area, so there are no houses, no buildings, no businesses. It's situated behind a prominent mountain with hilly ridges boxing in the valley. It is said that this valley is a center for the unexplained. Stories ranging from lights in the sky, ghost cars, ladies in white, random screams, the usual stories that surround almost every isolated dirt road. The place is surrounded with rumors. It is, however, in actuality, a dangerous place. Being situated near the US-Mexico border, it is a pathway frequented for drug smuggling, and being an isolated dirt road on the outskirts of a major city, things tend to go down there. You have your usual terrible stuff, like carjacking, people having their lives ended, as well as lots of bad other things. But a murder in particular stands out. The apparent poisoning of a teenage girl in a blue floral dress that was never identified, found barefoot on the side of the road. Now, time to share my experience. I had driven down the road late at night several times with friends for fun. The place has very few trees, let alone any large ones, but about midway down the road there is a very large tree hanging halfway over the road. This tree has always given me a bad feeling, so I never felt comfortable stopping there to explore. However, this night I was determined. So once and for all I had to know if this place had something weird going on. I wanted my own experience, and I wanted it badly. I had dug up my family's old Ouija board and studied for weeks on the proper use of it, and how to get the results you want. The whole shebang. We purchased the correct candles and found the most pure salt we could find, and we drove out to the road. This ended up being a bit of an event, as about 10 people showed up. 4 of us used the Ouija board, 2 filmed, and 4 sat in lawn chairs. Once we all got ready, we began. I, being dumb and unoriginal, thought we should go straight to Demon Land and try to anger a demon and contact it. Which demon? Pazuzu. Again, I was dumb and unoriginal. Well, after we initially started, we heard what sounded like orchestral music being played. Being on a road, we figured it was another car driving down in the distance, but would wait for it to pass and continue, because it would be a bit awkward if someone drove by and a bunch of people were summoning a demon. We waited 25 minutes, but no car showed up. There were no headlights, no noise besides the music, and us being a bit confused and somewhat scared, we carried on. The planchette was moving, but based on the answers, someone had to be moving it. So when a random twig snapped and everyone jumped out of fear, I just stayed with my finger on the planchette. One person, the person moving the planchette, got too scared and opted out, so I and 2 others braved on. I did my best to anger whatever could be out there, and to my surprise we got a response. There was no music being played anymore, and the piece was moving. I asked if anyone was there, and if they wished to communicate. The piece slowly moved to yes in a slow, smooth motion that honestly felt terrifying. It felt like it was being dragged across the board, not like someone was pushing or sliding it. With the confirmation of something wishing to speak, I moved to the next question. Are you Pazuzu? The same feeling. The planchette moved to no. My heart sunk. I was thinking, okay, well I got something biting, let's see what it is. I see everything is fixed on the board, eyes locked, and I asked probably the next logical thing that most people would. Are you a good spirit? Then the two phones that were being used to film the event turn off. They then wouldn't turn back on, and the planchette begins to move. It slides to the letter G, and we all let out a big phew. Everyone was relieved it was going to spell good, but then unsurprisingly, it moved to O, more confirmation, but then it stopped. Nothing. No movement at all for over 5 minutes. It was telling us to leave. I asked, "Do you want us to go?" And as I finished the question, my friend drops to her knees. She was screaming and crying. I moved the planchette to goodbye, and I say it and rushed to her and asked her what happened. She said someone was walking over us and pointed down the road. I looked down, and all I saw was a cloud of dust roll off the road 15 feet away. This was the most honest person I'd ever known, and decided right then that we were leaving. She described the person walking towards us as having dark hair, long limbs, but no distinguished facial features. They walked like a video game character, glitching where they stride definitely didn't match pace at all, and their feet didn't seem to touch the ground. When she looked at it, she said she felt every emotion she'd ever felt come over her. She equated it to the feeling of your family dying while you win the lottery on your wedding day. This was almost 2 years ago, and my friend still refuses to go out at night. I tried a year ago, and she cried in the car the whole time, saying she's getting closer. And yes, she's been attending therapy for this. I don't know what she saw that night, but I personally don't want to find out. I have not returned to the road since. I stored away the board, but it went missing 6 days later to the day, along with the candles and books. When I was about 8 or 9, my family took a trip skiing to a small resort a few hours from where we lived in Spain. The resort itself was a sleepy town of about 400 to 500 people, with a few small supermarkets and hotels and not much else. Typically, we picked the worst time possible to embark on the trip, which had been planned for a good few years. The night after we arrived, there was a blizzard, and we spent the first half of the week locked in the hotel. Although we were able to go outside for the remaining few days, we had little to do given that the slopes were shut. The story I want to tell comes from those first few days locked in the hotel. Despite my parents' annoyance at the time of the trip being a nightmare, myself and my sister, who was 11 months older, had a fantastic time. Locked up in the mountains with nothing to do, we were able to spend our days running around the hotel, eating sweets and watching TV in the lobby. I should probably mention at this point that the hotel is somewhat of a maze. The large bar/restaurant area where my parents sat each day, reading, was at the center of the hotel. A myriad of smaller rooms then connected to the bar area at random points, shooting off in different directions. These rooms often had no discernible functions. Each one had the same mahogany interior, and they were full of couches, fireplaces, and antiques that allowed for a great game of hide and seek. The room would often have offshoots themselves, connecting to new rooms which would be then connected to yet more useful wooden caves. As such, it was possible to be 4 or 5 rooms away from the main hotel area at any time, without knowing exactly where you were, or how to get back. Anyway, at some point along the weekend, myself and my sister decided to play hide and seek. Bearing in mind the above, it was almost an impossible challenge to find the hider, especially if they moved. To this day, I'm certain my sister was a filthy little cheat. At one point in the game, I was about to give up on searching for her until I heard her voice from what sounded like a few rooms away. After successfully navigating the web of rooms, I emerged to find her sitting on a couch alongside a German man with grey hair, probably in his 60s if I had to guess. As soon as I emerged into the room, the man turned to me and told me he was talking to my sister and taking her to the swimming pool, and asked if I wanted to join them. I remember immediately thinking it's odd that there was a swimming pool that we hadn't heard of. My parents had been complaining that morning about how much TV we were watching, and so I was sure they would have taken us there had they known about it. And besides, the hotel did not seem this size to be able to host one. I told the man that I'd have to ask my parents first, and told my sister to come back with me to find them. He immediately replied that I should go, and that he'll take my sister on ahead. I told my sister she absolutely had to come with me, but excited at the thought of the swimming pool, she said she didn't want to go. We began to argue with the man taking my sister's side, and encouraging me to go ask my parents' permission while he waited with my sister. I dug my foot in, telling my sister that our parents would be very cross if we went somewhere on our own, and after a few minutes of bickering she eventually gave in and came back with me, giving her assurance to the man that we'd be back. Of course, when we told our parents, they were livid. My dad went back to the room to try and find the man, but with all the offshoots and given that all the random rooms looked the same, it was almost impossible to be sure we were in the right one. In any case, there was no sign of him. I remember my dad screaming at the clerk at the hotel lobby that he needed a list of names of all male guests and their room numbers, but of course they wouldn't give it to him. We spent the rest of the trip by our parents' side, terrified of the thought of being locked up in a blizzard with him. Thankfully, we never saw the man again. The scary thing, we checked with the lobby, and as we'd imagined, the hotel didn't have a pool. So scary German man who wanted to take me in a blizzard? Let's not meet again. My dad died in 2016. I was able to spend a lot of time with him before he went, and my brother and I set him up in an amazing care facility in Australia, where he was for a few months before he went. The place had a small cafe with a barista, and I would frequently go and grab us a coffee. Dad couldn't walk anymore, and I was having a hard time getting him to a wheelchair to take him out of the room and outside. He also wasn't eating much, or interested in much of anything. This was all pretty normal for someone who's dying. I knew he was, and I knew he'd go pretty soon, but nobody else seemed to think so for some reason. Anywho, I asked Dad if he'd like a latte, and for the first time in a few days he said yes. I was excited he was interested. So I headed over to the cafe, got us both a coffee and headed right back. I walked into the room and said, "I've got your coffee, Dad." I noticed Dad was staring into the far corner of the room. He looked from the corner of the room to me, and when I walked in, then after I spoke, he looked back to the corner and back at me and said, "What about Mum?" My mum died in 2008. Now, since I've seen ghosts and a bunch of weird experiences, I'm all aboard on this train, and without missing a beat, I look at the corner at him and say, "I can go get a coffee for Mum as well, no worries." And Dad looked from me to the corner, back at me, the reality clearly dawning on him. Then he quickly shook his head. While my dad did have some confusion when he first came to this place, he settled down pretty quick. He didn't see anything else after he mentioned that, and was lucid right up until the end. I'd like to think that my mum did come to see him off. When I was in my senior year of high school, one of my friends had a Ouija board that we would play with often. One night we decided to play the Ouija board at the cemetery because we wanted to see what would happen. We believed in the paranormal to some extent, but we were also skeptical. We just wanted to have a good time and hopefully get spooked. We specifically liked this cemetery because it was the easiest to sneak into. Its fence was a very low, short wall that you could hop over. There were recently dug places for new burials that were going to happen. We played a few times and spoke to some ghosts. Nothing really scary or weird. We asked them if they were alone when they died, what their names were, etc. While playing, we started sensing this really awful smell, like rotten eggs and dead animal. We looked around and assumed it was coming from the holes that were freshly dug. We eventually left it because we got bored and the smell was gross. When we got in the car, we took off our shoes and started to sanitize our hands. That smell suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was very strong. It smelled like death. We kept putting hand sanitizer on our hands, and when we would sniff them, it still smelled like it. After realizing the smell would not leave our hands, we all of a sudden got a chill and began screaming. We were all screaming inside my friend's car like girls from a horror movie. We finally calmed down and my friend turned on the engine and we bolted. We eventually started laughing because the whole ordeal was pretty funny, and we got what we wanted. But we'll never forget the smell and how it wouldn't leave us be. Quite a number of years ago, on my first trip to Africa, I was staying in a group campground in the Serengeti. The camp had quite a number of tents and was approved by the park management and was allotted one ranger with an AK-47 that looked like it was from the 70s. He patrolled around at night, but the camp had no barrier and he couldn't be everywhere. I was on my way back to my tent after playing cards into the night with those old crappy headlamps, which I had pointed to the ground. The camp was mostly empty, and my tent was at the farther end of where people were staying. I was watching my step as I looked, and the wash from my headlamp gives off enough light for me to see two pairs of eyes, one amber and one blue, stare back at me from about 20 feet away in the dark. I can't see what it is, they're just staring at me. Not small eyes either, probably about 2 or so feet off the ground. There's a point where you're so absolutely terrified your entire being goes into overdrive. Fight or flight doesn't ever happen. You can't feel anything, your body continues to work on its own accord, but all your mental capacity is focused on what's right in front of you. No adrenaline, almost like an out-of-body experience. I'm completely unaware of it, but I continue to walk, and since I don't show any change of behavior, the eyes turn off me and walk away. I go into my tent as calm as can be, just in complete shock, climb into bed, and wake up the next morning, bring the ranger over and find the tracks. Those eyes belong to 2 spotted hyena pack hunters, on par with lions. I've had other encounters in Africa over the years, but that's been the only time I've ever been alone in the presence of a superior number of predators without any kind of weapon to defend myself, especially at night. To preface this, I was young, maybe 18 or 19, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. My father owns 3 businesses and was actively dating his business partner and was providing for her. She also made advances on me which kind of creeped me out. She would buy us all food, and at first I was grateful, but then I started becoming nervous as she wanted to be alone with me a lot. My father ended up getting married but didn't tell her, and she got really upset with him and told me not to tell her. She came to my job and demanded to see my father, to which I told her he wasn't here. She screamed at me and said we would soon regret it. Due to the disturbing nature of it, I called the cops, and all they did was take my name, but didn't actually look into it. So fast forward, I come home around midnight, as I had just come home from my second job, dead tired from school. I ate and crashed on my bed. It had to be at least 3 in the morning when I heard my door open. At first I didn't move because I assumed it was my calico cat Misty pouring at my door, as she liked to sleep with me. When I groaned her name, she didn't answer. It struck me as strange, but I wasn't worried until I felt a presence standing over me. I quickly woke up and discovered my father's ex in our house above me, crazy-eyed. She was screaming and saying how she would get her revenge on my father. I quickly rolled out of bed, ran past her and called the authorities. She openly tried to fight my father's wife and tried to attack my father. The police came and arrested her on the spot. That was the scariest thing I've ever been through, and I'm glad I won't see her again. Now I sleep with a blade next to my bed and a taser. Please be careful, as you never know who might want to pay you a late-night visit. Outside my town, there is an old abandoned orphanage and a memorial for all the children that were abused and passed away. and 5 of us decided it would be a great idea to go out there and explore it. We scoped the place out during the day to find ways to get in, and came back at night at around 11 to 11:30 p.m. We parked a few hundred meters down the road from it, out of sight just in case of police, and we began walking. We got close to the gate before one of my friends, who was the biggest skeptic adrenaline junkie alive, stops dead in his tracks, turns around and starts sprinting, telling us that he saw someone in front of him. We all start running back towards the car. The entire time, there's rustling from the bushes like someone was following us. We get in the car and I turn around and see 2 to 3 figures clear as day standing behind the car, watching us drive off. 2 girls and a boy, between the ages of 13 and 16. So we decide to forget that and go to the witch's grave. In hindsight, an awful idea, but we were excited to go out and explore. I'm very into pendulum and actually had mine with me, and on the way up was communicating with a spirit that decided to follow us from the orphanage. Her name was Faith, and she was absolutely lovely. Around this time, I started getting a massive headache and my eyes were watering, but thought nothing of it. I started getting really tired and disassociated and fell asleep, or at least I thought I fell asleep. I woke up and it seemed like only 5 minutes had passed. We were just reaching the town with the grave, and one of the guys sitting beside me, Jay, was saying how I was staring out the window the entire time, going into a burst of laughter, and I sounded different, and my laugh was different. We pull up to the witch's grave. Jay swears that we saw someone walk past it. We made a Ouija board and wanted to communicate with spirits. I didn't want to get out the car, and neither did Jay. So we sat in the car listening to music while the rest of us sat in front of the grave messing with the board. Music started doing all funky and weird stuff. The radio was acting up, and prior everything was working perfectly. About 15 minutes pass, and Jay decides to get out to see how they're doing. He comes back in, followed by everyone else, seeming a little freaked out, and I asked what was wrong, and my other friend says that Jack was staring behind him. When he goes, "He's right behind you," he turned around and went back to the car. Jack had no memory of this, but the rest of the guys backed him up. The music stopped working, and we started driving back down the mountain. It got incredibly cold even with the heater on, so I started getting a massive headache behind my head and back of my ears, which is apparently a sign of spiritual attachment. Charlie is driving, Darren is in the passenger seat, and Michael was right, with Jay in the middle and I was on the left seat. Jay started tearing up a little bit and went silent before he started laughing. He turned to me very slowly with the biggest grin on his face and just stared. I asked him what he was doing, and he never replied. A few minutes later he was himself again. Charlie a few minutes later started spacing out really bad. We were using the pendulum, consulting and asking if there were any possible harm coming out this way, in which it violently answered yes, and we all yelled for Charlie to pull over. He was refusing, but eventually he did, and they swapped seats. I blacked out from there. From here I only remember what the guys filled me in on and what happened. So apparently, Charlie joked and said they should use the Ouija board and see what it wants. Upon that, my other friend replied in the most polite and formal tone that they should. Keep in mind that it's also the only thing he said the entire time, and I agreed with him, despite being very against wanting to use the board before. Apparently the 3 of them all decided it would be the best option to get some sage and burn it away, whatever it was that was attached. I'm the only person who owns sage, and upon hearing the mention of it, they said I burst out crying, apologizing and begging for them to not get it, saying that I didn't want to leave. Jay was freaking out, so him and Darren swapped seats. Darren's family is a line of white witches, so apparently he tried his best to bless both Charlie and myself, in which my responses to that were violently pushing him off me, thrashing about repeatedly and saying no, and very coldly and calmly saying, "I don't like that. Darren is like one of my best friends, and I hold no ill will against him." So they do the sage. I let them in, and flat out refused to touch the sage and stood very far away from it. I got in the car and headed towards the riverbank. It was pliant but very slow to follow. They described him to be a zombie, my other friend. I was resisting, hesitating, crying and refusing to follow them, so they practically dragged me along. As soon as the sage was lit, they told me that I bolted and got as far away from it as possible and tried to jump over the edge of the river. They had to grab me and forcibly hold me and drag me in place. They said I was crying violently and that this would be over soon. I wake up. I was on the ground, still being held, with Darren raving the sage around me. Charlie checked on his phone and the first thing he said was, "It's only 1 a.m. 2 minutes ago." I felt confused and disoriented and tired. So of course, the best action for all of us was to go home and sleep it off. I stayed with my friends for the night, woke up the next day feeling like I just drank 2 bottles of vodka and went home. I still felt awful, so I went home, the headache behind my ears, and that still wasn't good. I felt cold despite having no fever, and it was a warm day, and I was wearing a hoodie. I was hearing knocking noises and footsteps outside my door. I had bad heart pain, I was throwing up, and my nose was bleeding badly. My friends messaged me saying that there was something wrong. Their mom was concerned about me, and they were coming to get me. So I went with them back to theirs. I explained to Jay's mom and dad what happened. Jay's dad, who doesn't really believe in this kind of stuff, but both of them had had paranormal experiences before, told me to go outside and stand on the grass, barefoot, and ground myself. That kind of worked. My other friend also turned around to stare at the gate because we both heard and saw something, and Jay's mum later confirmed that she saw it too. Ever since then, I see and hear things 100 times more than I used to, and I always carry obsidian with me. This story takes place nearly 30 years ago now, and is a memory I have spoken a lot about in therapy. The day was like any other. I got up in the morning, tired, and really couldn't be bothered to leave for school, but my mother was at my door nagging at me to get up. I open my eyes and take a good look around my room, spot my uniform on the chair from yesterday, and get ready to have a shower. Within about half hour, I'm ready to leave to school. I'd put on the bare minimum of makeup that we were allowed to wear and go sit at the table to have breakfast. I see my brother watching TV, and my dad is reading the newspaper. My mum looks like she's getting ready for another day of doing whatever she does at home, cooking, cleaning, and the like. She was also about 8 months pregnant. So we're just there having small talk before I look at my watch and realize I have to make the groggy journey to school. I walk down the 5 or 6 flights of stairs until I get to the bottom floor and slowly make my way out. I make the bus in good time and reach school before the bell. Now, school was a blur, and I don't remember what time it happened exactly, but from one moment to another, the ground started to shake. Earthquakes are not that uncommon where I live, but this one was different. This one was huge. We were instructed to all get underneath our desks. We all had individual desks at the time, and so we did. I could hear girls crying near me, even guys. Everyone was frightened. The ground was shaking, the ceiling. I was so scared it was going to collapse on me, and thankfully it did not. By the time the earthquake was over, we left. But when we looked out, we saw that we were fortunate. The amount of carnage that had been inflicted on our city was huge. Buildings that I had gone past on my bus ride were no longer standing. Streets were covered in debris and rubble, and there were cries and the sounds of emergency sirens everywhere. As you can imagine with any situation like this, the first thing you think about is your family. I wondered about my brother. The last time I saw him was watching TV. Or my mum, her baby. My dad. How were they and the rest of my family? I desperately wanted to leave, to run home and make sure my mum was okay. My dad worked across town. I didn't know if he was safe either. My brother went to this exact school, but I'm sure he'd be fine, right? Doubt is what really frightened me. Not knowing if that morning had been the last time I'd see my parents, if my ungrateful ass and not saying thank you to my mum would be the last gesture that she'd remember me if she had perished. It was about 5 hours or so before the school let us leave. Thankfully, during that time I found my brother, who was a few years younger, safe and sound, and I think I cried more than I ever had in my life when I found out he was alright. But the fear still consumed my heart, and I needed to find my family. Things didn't go well from this point on. My dad suffered serious injuries and unfortunately lost his life to them a few days later in the absolutely oversaturated hospitals. When I was finally allowed to go home, or at least a semblance of a home, I realized that our house was no longer standing. It was an apartment building, and it had pretty much collapsed. Eventually, they found my mother. She didn't make it. These things still haunt me, and was one of the reasons I moved from that country a long time ago. I still don't know if I'll ever go back. I'm deadly scared of earthquakes. I'm a 22-year-old female, and when I was 14, my family and I went to a resort in Antalya, Turkey. The resort was relatively small, and every day there were plenty of activities that involved all the guests, like pool games and competitions. The restaurant was also cafeteria style, so everyone ate together. As a result, basically everyone at the resort knew each other well and by name, and became pretty close-knit after a few days. In particular, there was a middle-aged, bald British guy called Danny, and his 2 little kids were about 2 to 4. Everyone at the resort seemed to really love this family, as he was a single father who was on vacation, and his 2 little kids were cute. So they became popular pretty quickly. At one point I was walking back up to my room when I heard another guest at the hotel say my name in the context of volunteering me to help Danny with something. I went to see what was going on, and the other guest told me that Danny needed help taking his kids upstairs because they were being badly sunburnt and he couldn't carry them both at once. However, the other guest was busy with something, so he suggested that I should help Danny instead. I didn't really think anything of it, so I picked up the little girl and walked with Danny and his son towards the elevator. We eventually got to his hotel room, and I tried to drop off the girl by the door, but he politely asked me to drop her off on the couch. Unfortunately, I was naive and too trusting, so I thought it wouldn't be a problem for me to just step in and drop her off, quickly, before I go. Worst case scenario, I would scream and people in the neighboring rooms or hallways would hear me. So I stepped inside, and as I dropped Danny's daughters off on the couch, he closed the door and turned the lights off behind me. It was pitch black, because my eyes hadn't adjusted yet, when I heard him leaning close to my ear and say, "Kids, say hello to your new mummy." I instantly got goosebumps all over and my heart dropped. Whenever I tell this story to anyone, they always say that he was probably kidding, but I can assure you 100% that he was not. I panicked and started feeling up the wall for the light switch or the door, and he could tell that I was trying to leave, so he said, "Aren't you gonna stay and watch some telly with us?" But I'd finally found the doorknob and just made a run for it. I ran downstairs crying and so afraid. When I tried to tell my family, no one believed that he was being serious or creepy because they'd all met him and thought he was so sweet, a lovely, single father. I didn't see him the next day or in the following days, so I think he checked out after that. I'd like to preface this by saying that not all mental health professionals are terrible people. Good doctors and good medication saved my life. I didn't grow up in the US. So if you see something in this story that makes you go, "That's not how this works," keep in mind that in other countries, there might be different laws. I was a troubled kid. I'm kind of a troubled person in general, but when I was in my early teens, specifically in this story 14, I was cutting, suicidal, and refusing to go to school. So I was put on a waiting list for a children's mental hospital. I know now for a fact that I was on the waiting list for close to half a year, and that should have been the first warning sign. At that time, I enjoyed being on sick leave from school, which basically meant I got to play The Sims until 6 in the morning for 5 months straight. But when I had to pack my stuff and actually go to the hospital, I, of course, didn't really want to go. I didn't want to get help, don't get me wrong, but the idea of being away from home for 6 weeks, which is the standard time they take to analyze you and watch you and give you a diagnosis, after which you can choose to pursue treatment, scares me. I arrived at the hospital in tears, my mum carrying my suitcase for me. The nurses noticed that obviously I didn't want to stay. "Are you here of your own free will?" the doctor asked me. I shook my head. They just shrugged it off, saying that they could get a judicial decision forcing me to stay here. I never got to talk to a judge. I never got to defend or explain myself, and as far as I knew, my parents didn't talk to a judge either. A judge glossed over my medical history and then signed a piece of paper that forced me to stay in the hellhole for the whole 6 weeks. The contents of my suitcase were searched, and I remember feeling like I had just arrived in prison. The first terrifying thing happened on my first night. As a cutter, my arms were in horrific shape. When my wounds healed, they'd itch. I scratched open some of my old scabs, and when I went to the nurse to ask for a bandage, everyone went nuts. In their eyes, I had purposely self-harmed, which they couldn't prove, but okay. So what do you do when a 14-year-old mental patient harms herself? Talk to her? Try to help? Nah. You take away all her jewelry, a necklace from my mom, a bracelet from my ex-girlfriend who, at the time, I still had very strong feelings for, and send her off out of her room for 24 hours. The timeout room was a small room with a big window that could just barely fit a bed. If I had to use the bathroom, I had to ask a nurse to accompany me. And no joke, at one point I was in the bathroom with a nurse standing guard in front of the door. She asked if I was doing okay, and I sarcastically responded with, "No, I'm cutting myself with toilet paper." She goes, "Really?" and rips open the door. All of my clothes, including my underwear and my PJs, were taken from my room and kept in the front office for the time I stayed in the timeout room. So whenever I needed clothes, I had to go up to the front office and ask for them. But apart from having to ask for clothes and bathroom trips, I was left completely alone in that room, and no one ever came to check on me. Getting out of the timeout room wasn't a lot better. For the first 2 weeks, I had horrible stomach problems. I would get up multiple times a night to use the bathroom, which, by the way, you didn't have one in your rooms, you had to walk down the hall to the bathrooms, because my stomach kept me up all night. I would often not get enough sleep, and would end up sleeping through the day, which led me to not taking part in the group activities. And instead of, I don't know, waking me up, I was scolded, and I quote, "If I was up all night roaming the halls, I'd be tired too. What do you want me to do, just crap in the bed?" And because I didn't partake in group activities, I couldn't earn outside time. Yes, I had to earn going outside. Even just sitting on the front steps with a nurse right next to me had to be earned. For the first 6 weeks, I was effectively locked up, except for school and weekends where I was allowed to go home. It was blatantly obvious that none of the nurses really cared about any of the patients. They weren't even real nurses, they were more like prison guards. One of them straight up looked like a homeless guy. Another sounded like she'd been a 5-pack-a-day smoker her whole life. And I mean, all of them were chain smokers. Every free second they'd use for smoke breaks, right outside the door too, with the doors open, so that all the other kids who were currently going through nicotine withdrawals could smell the cigarette smoke. I saw a real nurse once a week. She mainly checked for self-harm. One time, I self-harmed at home over the weekend. I told her my pet bunny did it, and she believed me. Within 6 weeks of staying at the mental hospital, I saw a psychiatrist a whopping 2 times. Once for a general introduction, and once for an IQ test. Oh, and did I mention that you were allowed to have a razor in the shower? Or the huge bird spider that sat in the corner of one of the showers for the entire time I stayed there? Or the cobwebs and silver fish that were everywhere? Anyone who's ever struggled with mental illness probably knows that sentences like, just pull yourself together, or get over it, are the least helpful things one could say to a mentally ill person. I've never heard it that much in my entire life. There was one instance where another patient, who was deadly afraid of spiders, came running out of her room in a borderline panic attack because she had woken up to a spider directly in front of her face. Know what they told her? Don't be such a baby, it's just a spider. They gave her a broom for her to get rid of the spider herself, which obviously she couldn't do. My roommate and I ended up helping her. Both of us were scared of spiders as well, mind you. But possibly the most outrageous thing that happened on my second to last day. Someone had told the guards that I had smuggled in a razor blade, so they pulled me out of breakfast and searched my body from top to bottom, stripping me naked, with the door to the nurse's room wide open. When they didn't find a razor blade on me, they tore my room apart. They didn't find one in there either, but found one laying in the floor of the hallway. It was still in a wrapper. I wasn't the only patient who cut herself. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was a single female patient who didn't. That blade could have belonged to anyone. They had no proof that it was mine. But of course, it was determined that it was mine, and despite me not having any new cuts on my arms, I was thrown into the timeout for another 24 hours. Literally my last 24 hours. And they paid so little attention to the timeout room that a fellow inmate was able to slip a letter with a razor blade inside under the door so I could take out my frustration on myself. In case any of you were wondering where my parents were in all of this, my mother wanted to get me out of that place as soon as she heard about the timeout room. But since my parents had joint custody, she needed my father to agree to it. My father deserves a let's not meet story on himself, but to make it short, he hadn't spoken to me in over 4 years, but was somehow convinced that I needed help and refused to get me out of there. My final diagnosis from that place? Narcissistic neurosis. I was 14, and to this day I have no idea how they came up with any kind of diagnosis, considering I had seen an actual doctor a total of 2 times. Additionally, this result was delivered to us, my parents and I, by the head doctor of the hospital who I'd never seen in my life during a conclusive meeting on my last day. I was offered to stay and start behavioral therapy, but I guess it goes without saying that I politely declined that offer. Every therapist and psychiatrist I have spoken to since, and trust me, there have been a few over the last 7 years, have disregarded that diagnosis completely. Some have even laughed at it. I'm currently diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, and a panic disorder, and my current psychiatrist has suggested I might suffer from borderline personality disorder. I guess the moral of the story is to always do research on the hospital you plan on getting yourself admitted to. I sure as hell hope I never have to see any of the guards, nurses, or doctors ever again. Strange things have been happening in our flat. So for starters, I am a practicing pagan, and have been my whole life. I am no stranger to the paranormal. I regularly sage our home or bless it while burning incense. We frequently have windows open, allowing a breeze through to whisk away any negative energy. I have a lot of experience with Ouija and seances. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not new to this kind of thing, but I'll be damned if they don't freak me out. I moved into the flat on the 14th of December 2018. When we came to view the flat, I immediately felt a positive energy. It was like I belonged there with my little one. The energy remained positive for the longest time, and little things happened. For example, I'd put my phone down in the living room, pop up to check on my daughter, come back and my phone would be nowhere. I would spend the next 10 to 15 minutes searching for it everywhere to no avail. Then I'd go back to where I had left it, and you guessed it, right there it would be. Now, of course, this could be put down to simple absent-mindedness on my part, but after it happened not only to me but also my fiancé and friends who regularly visit, I'm inclined to believe it's something a bit more. I own a Ouija board, just a cheap little thing. I store the board in the living room, currently on the bookshelf and the planchette in my kitchen with my other witchy bits. It would frequently fall off the bookshelf or the fireplace or the TV shelf, regardless of how it was placed. And of course I have no logical explanation for this. One night after my fiancé had moved in, our daughter was at her dad's for the weekend, and my mum was over for dinner and we did a séance. My mum and I have conducted and practiced in many séances over the years, so we're not just kids messing about, and I can't stress this enough. We were slow to start, the energy was low, but we soon had something come through, but it was sluggish and easily confused. It was finally able to tell us that it was not alone and that something was stopping it from communicating with us. Whatever was stopping it came through stronger and started asking us to lend it our souls. Nope. After a while, without much contact, we closed the séance and saged the crap out of the flat just to be safe. And at first it seemed to have worked, until a few weeks ago when lockdown started. Our little girl frequently gets in bed with us. She's 3, and we co-slept until we moved in here when she was nearly 2. We have times where she spends most of the night in her bed, but since lockdown began, she wakes up at least 2 to 3 times a night, gets in bed with us, as her room is right next door, and there's a light from the bathroom so that it's not too dark, and she's never had a problem walking from her room to ours, often without us even realizing she's gone into bed with us. The bedroom doors do not slam, the carpet is too thick at the bottom, and they're fire doors, with a chain that causes them to close slowly. We've tried to slam the door to our bedroom, it doesn't slam. This is important. Another important tidbit. My fiancée sleeps like they're dead. She never wakes up to our daughter at night. But a couple of weeks into the lockdown, my fiancé woke up to our daughter crying, and what sounded like a little person's footsteps on the laminate flooring in the hall, but wasn't fully awake until our bedroom door slammed. She got out of bed to see where she had gone, and she was in the room, as far away from the bedroom door as she could possibly be. When Little saw my fiancée, she shouted that she wanted Mummy, and ran straight past her and straight to our room, into bed with me. She's had no history of sleepwalking. The next morning we spoke about what had happened. I had very uncharacteristically slept through the whole thing, up to Little getting into bed with me. This is important to note, as I always wake up every night, and I wasn't especially tired. There's no reason for me not to have woken up like normal, and yet I slept through it. We came to the conclusion that firstly, the door should not have slammed, particularly if my little one had pushed it slightly open to get into bed with us. Secondly, why did she run out of the room instead of just getting into bed with us as usual? And thirdly, why was she cowering in the corner of her bedroom? Another important tidbit, our daughter and my fiancé have a wonderful relationship and has zero reason to fear either of us. She's never reprimanded for getting into bed with us or waking up with us. Now this is creepy, but it gets spookier. Later that day, we were all sitting in the living room, and our daughter's phone, used for Paw Patrol and kids puzzles, that was on the fireplace, fell rather violently without rhyme or reason. We were all sitting down. Daughter wasn't jumping about. Our neighbours weren't banging on the walls and there was no reason for her phone to have fallen. There have been times where the living room, which stays open when pushed all the way, has randomly slammed with no breeze or anything that might have caused it to close. And then our little one woke up. I went in to soothe her back to sleep. She had kicked her covers off, so I pulled them back over her. Then she woke up again talking about a monster under the bed and asking me if she was safe in her bed. She had a mid-sleeper, so there's space under her bed, but she'd never worried about monsters being under there before. I wanted to share our story and maybe gain some outside perspective on it, and I'll keep anyone updated on what else happens. But I cleansed the flat today, and I'm really hoping it does the trick. I used to climb at Joshua Tree a lot, a decade ago, so we would camp there frequently. One Halloween we were hanging out by the fire and a group of 3 guys walk up and ask if we wanted to head to the Chasm of Doom. Without hesitation I replied, yeah, sure. My friends were less enthusiastic, but I was able to convince them to come along. This place had a certain amount of legend surrounding it in jade tree climbing circles, so it was somewhat known to us, but we still had yet to get there. This was pre-Instagram, so there wasn't much info on it at the time, other than how to get there and its talus cave. As we walked over, the guys were filling us in on the tradition of the chasm. Always take first timers at night, no headlamps or lights allowed. The leaders shout beta. Instructions were to go on, what to avoid, and how not to die. If you have to follow it, you want to make it through. If you cheat and use a light while in there, you risk upsetting the spirits or something, and we laughed that off. As we reached the end of our walk to the entrance of the cave, one of our guides asked if any of us had claustrophobia issues. I laughed and asked why, to which they described the birth canal, a horizontal crack that you have to wiggle through at some point in the cave that was very cramped. After hearing this, one of my friends noped out of there, and being that the other friend and he were dating at the time, they both decided to leave and return to camp. That left me standing at the base of a hill ready to scramble up the mouth of a cave with 3 strangers I'd met 15 minutes ago to be led through, blind. Sounds perfectly safe and rational. We scramble up over boulders, under boulders, past yucca sprouting from cracks, rats scurried around, and the mood was starting to rise above the mountains across the valley as we reached the mouth of the chasm. It was a vertical crack no more than a few feet wide. We file in one by one, with the leader instructing us where to step, where to place our hands for balance, and warning us about protrusions from the ceiling so we don't hit our heads. The pace was slow, and it was not terribly interesting for the first few minutes, as I was more interested in how my brain was shifting the way it perceives physical space through touch rather than sight. In the complete darkness, I was constructing a 3-dimensional map of the cave in my head. It felt like I was looking at the physical space, even in the pitch black. For a while, I remained more fascinated by this than the actual activity, up until the point where the ground had been relatively flat with some small obstacles to avoid so you didn't trip and fall on your face. The leader had just instructed us that there was a large boulder you had to crouch under, and then immediately after there would be something that you had to climb over. He did not state any details about these objects, so figuring out your way around them was all up to you and your appendages to identify the parameters of the space that you were in and how to navigate it. Again, this all felt fascinating until I tried to climb over it. I was last in line and everyone was still here, so I knew that moving forwards was not going to result in my death or anything, but my confidence was completely sucked out of me by a very simple comment by the leader. When you climb over, make sure you stay to the right. If you go too far to the left, you'll fall. At this point, the wonder of the process of navigating through the cave gave way to a growing sense of anxiety over real risk or injury. My relaxed state was now being corrupted by scenarios of falling down a hole in complete darkness. To make matters worse, when I gingerly tried to reach down to the other side of my toes to find solid footing, all I found was air. I wondered how far down was ground beneath me. Was I in the wrong position? Am I dangling over a potential fall? I had long gotten over my fear of heights thanks to climbing, but this created a unique form of vertigo. All the physiological responses were there: tense muscles, anxiety, disorientation, and I felt stuck. Part of me wanted to go back, but being that everyone had already passed it, the thought of navigating my way back out solo seemed not only risky for my physical well-being, but my pride too. I was tense with anxiety, but convinced myself to just commit to whatever drop there was. I let it go, and started to fall. A total of 2 inches. Along the way there were more situations like this, including some sections that required climbing blind, making a wrong turn and backtracking. Even though I had come to realize that my anxiety was also flying blind, I tried to rationalize it away. It still persisted. It didn't help that the leader was dramatizing every danger to make us think we got lost. We all talked crap to lighten the mood when it got too much. Finally, we got to the birth canal. They worked their way through it, and I listened to each of their complaints as they struggled with it, hoping to have an easier go. I wasn't terribly claustrophobic being stuck in a tight place in the dark, but it wasn't something I wanted to experience. I turned around, lied on my back, and started through head first. If you can imagine a penguin trying to move between 2 mattresses on his back, you can imagine the position I was in. Movement was slow and restrained. My back slid on a slab and my chest was pressed against the roof. I got stuck. I had to back out a bit, move in a slightly different trajectory, and find a spot that had more clearance. Finally, I made it through and had to climb up about 10 feet until I rejoined the group on the top of some boulder. We were now boulder hopping back over the chasm we had just navigated through. Essentially, it's just a crack in the rocks and large boulders would fall in and get stuck, essentially creating a roof. To continue, we had to head back the way we came, following the chasm back. It felt like we were in a Donkey Kong level in a sense. The boulders didn't completely cover the chasm and the drops were about 15 to 30 feet according to the leader. I wasn't sure if it was an exaggeration at first, but by the time we reached the end of that section, the moonlight was shining through, and I could see that any fall would be very serious. Finally made it to the top and climbed some sketchy slab to get a great view of the valley being lit by the moon. We yelled down to other people heading into the mouth of the cave, and sat there for a while taking in the afterglow of the adrenaline, drank a beer, and laughed off the melodrama of the whole endeavor. It was honestly one of the most fun things I'd ever done, but it certainly scared the crap out of me. We then had to find our way down, which ended up requiring some awkward down climbs as we ended up going the wrong way. At least we had the moon for that part. Two years ago, my husband and I flew to LA for a weekend getaway. We stayed at a boutique hotel off Sunset. It's more of a hipster type place, not normally somewhere I'd stay, but it was nice, clean, and had good vibes. We met up with our friends who live in LA, and went out for dinner and drinks. It was a late night, and we came back to the hotel. I was exhausted and jet-lagged. It was 1:30 a.m. or something like that. My husband is a very deep sleeper. I'm an extremely light sleeper, except when I've had a bunch of drinks, which I had definitely consumed that night. So it was lights out for both of us very quickly. Around 3 a.m. I suddenly wake up and open my eyes. There's a light on in our room. The room had been totally dark when we went to bed. The light came from the doorway, which illuminated the silhouette of a man standing at the foot of the bed, just standing there staring. For a moment I'm speechless, confused, and also slightly intoxicated and haven't moved. My reaction is delayed, and then the stark fear and reality kick in. I grasp and say, "What the hell?" The man was wearing a red plaid shirt and had dark hair and a beard. I couldn't make out his features as my eyes were adjusting to waking up, and the lighting that illuminated him shadowed half his face. The man says, "I need to speak to Drake." I know this may sound somewhat comical, but I assure you at the time it was terrifying. So I scream, "Get the hell out of here!" which jolts my husband awake, who immediately sits up and sees this man at the foot of our bed. My husband is 6'5", which may not be evident given half his body is underneath the bedding, But either way, the man responds, sorry, wrong room, and bolts out, slamming the door shut behind him. My husband jumps up and runs for the door, but I stop him from going outside into the hallway. Who knows if the man is waiting there trying to lure him out, or whether other people are there ready to pounce. I keep looking through the peephole but don't see anything. At this point we are both shocked and in disbelief and probably still drunk. We call down to the front desk but no one answers. We call repeatedly and still no one replies. We contemplate what to do, and around 20 minutes later we decide to get dressed and go down to the front desk. There is an employee at the front desk and there's also a bar in the lobby. My husband walks around to see if he can spot the guy who was in our room. As he's searching, I go up and start telling the guy behind the front desk what happened. But as I begin this story, I burst into tears, and it's only then that I realize how shaken up I am about it all. The employee gets the manager and he asks me what time the man came into the room, but I don't know how long he was standing there until I woke up and saw him. I think he must have been there a while for me to just wake up. My husband comes back empty-handed. We go back up to the room. The next day the manager calls and says there wasn't anything on the security cameras, but I didn't believe him. He offers us a free night as compensation. Even though he claims he didn't see anything, we take the free night because what else can you do? We just want to go about the rest of our mini vacation. Why was the man in our room? How did he have a working key card? But the thought I have most trouble with, what would have happened if I hadn't have woken up? Our door was locked, but clearly someone had a duplicate key card. Here's what I've learned. If you don't already, always put the deadlock on your hotel room door. It's something we never thought to do, and now I always check it twice. My first job was at a skilled nursing facility. I usually worked day shift, but I had picked up night shift because they were so short-staffed. We only had a handful of people working at night, so it was pretty quiet. I'm sitting at the far end of the nurse's station, which is at the end of the back hallway. I hear a call light go off, and I remember thinking it was strange because the resident who lived in the room had end-stage dementia and didn't move much. I go to the room, and the blinds were moving, and the patient looked like she was sleeping. I called her name, and she didn't respond, which was her baseline. But then I put my hand on her shoulder, and she was dead cold. I turned the call light off and turned the light on. She had passed, and from the coolness of her skin and stiffness, I think it had been a while. I then went to find a CNA to help with her. I also figured the blinds were moving because of our old heater that sat under the blinds. I go back to my desk and check the chart for funeral information and such, and the call light goes off again. At this point I thought maybe a CNA was calling me to the room, so I walked back up down to the hallway to look for them. I then cancelled the call light from the nurse's station. There was no one around except for sleeping residents. I went to the nurse's station, where one of our CNAs was sitting reading a book. I told her what happened, and she said she had been there the whole time. We head back down the hallway to find the light going off again and the door shut. Maybe I had shut the door, and maybe the heater was moving the curtains, but I'll never quite understand the call light. I truly believe she was letting us know that her soul was free from her body, and that she wanted to say goodbye to us. She was a long-term resident who never had visitors, and I truly think we were all she had in the end. Nothing ever spooky happened in the room again, or at least not for the following year that I was there. I'm usually a pretty jumpy person when it comes to supernatural stories and such, but for some strange reason I wasn't scared at all. It was like a peaceful goodbye. I don't know how else to explain it. When I was in high school, I got the flu very badly. I had such a high fever the doctors were worried about seizures and/or brain damage. In the hospital, and after they were able to get me to a semi-human temperature, they wanted to x-ray my lungs for damage. I went to walk to radiology, but my doctor saw me, panicked, and said I should not be standing, let alone walking, so they plop me in a wheelchair and roll me down. My nurse situates me near the machine and tells me to wait there for her, and then we'd get started. She left the room, and I just was kind of looking around, waiting, and I saw another nurse, very pretty with dark hair, in the room. She told me to go with her. I shook my head and said no, and the other nurse said I needed to stay here. The pretty nurse asked if I was sure, and I said yes. My nurse came back and began to get me ready for my chest x-ray. It was then that I noticed that the door she entered from was the only one, and the pretty nurse was gone. So in the end, I think I was dying, and an angel told me to go with her, but I said no. I had a patient with cirrhosis related to fatty liver. I cancelled him heavily prior to this for him to lose weight, but he didn't heed my advice. He developed diabetes and then developed a terrible, non-healing ulcer on his leg, then the other. Both soon spread to gangrene and he was admitted to hospital for bilateral leg amputations. He only said one thing to me after he woke up after the operation. "Doctor, good news, I've lost a bit of weight." He died a few hours later. I miss him very much. I went from being a social butterfly in regards to dating to a nearly paranoid hermit. Here's why. I'm 30. I've been on a lot of dates through my adulthood, mostly because I enjoy meeting new people, and I suppose psychoanalyzing them. That sounds odd, but I did a major in psychology for a reason, and I just think humans are fascinating. Of course there are certain criteria. No hardcore drug users, no creeps. I don't want to go out with someone my mum's age. I could go on, but you get it. This has been a positive in many ways. Networking, making new friends, playing matchmaker, gaining insight on dating in general, and sometimes someone surprises me, and they are nothing like I imagined. Maybe their pictures were bad, or I knew them from work or a formal setting, and their personality is marked differently in a casual setting. And honestly, even if it doesn't work out, it's cool when that happens because it reminds me not to judge people and keep an open mind. So I've been on some bad first dates, so bad that they make awesome stories, and when my friends are depressed, these are awesome little tales I can whip out to make people laugh. When I'm down about being single, I even think about these and have a chuckle. I'm just going to quickly give one of my favorites. I once went out with a recently honorably discharged Marine, relocated from another state. We got pulled over in a small town for speeding. He was taken to the station in cuffs because of a speeding ticket that wasn't marked as paid from where he was from, though he had in fact paid it. He later proved this to me because we dated for a short time after, but the cops at the time wouldn't tell me why he was arrested. We would joke about it all the time later on. The cop had to give me a lift back to my car because I couldn't drive his old truck that was a standard. It was so embarrassing. They gave me a very patriarchal lecture, and he was freaking out because he liked me and thought I would never talk to him again. We had to walk for 4 miles back to his truck upon release because he refused the cop's offer for a lift. He was a true gentleman, very traditional cowboy type. Stetson hat that came off when he ate, boots and the Levi's, white t-shirt and flannel shirt. Kinda looked like a young Tom Hardy now that I think of it. Maybe that's why this is my favorite bad first date story. Once we went to a river for a picnic and the same truck got stuck and we had no cell signal, so we had to hoof it through national forest for miles to call for help. A mountain lion ended up following us, and thankfully he had a conceal and carry and a very old school looking revolver, and I honestly felt like I was in a western movie or something. He was very protective and knew exactly what to do. Well, it didn't work out because he took another girl to the same spot and got stuck again. It was an amazing view. And someone who helped pull his truck out for the second time contacted me to let him know he was two-timing. In his defense, I sent mixed messages about dating other people and lived a few hours away, and he probably was a little young for me. Anyway, thank you for this story, Marine Cowboy Tom Hardy Doppelganger. But that is all kid stuff compared to this central story. I was on a dumb dating app, not intending or expecting to go out with anyone from the site, because I was happy being single and had just ended a relationship with an emotionally draining person. But as I preface, I'm very curious about people and open-minded, and that's why it came to bite me. I agreed to going out on a date with a guy who I had shared a lot of interests with, the same ethnic background, Romanian, which is rare where I live, and we even had the same birthday. He was very into astrology and tarot, and esoteric topics in general, including mythology and paganism. What stood out to me was that he was also very science-minded, and while being interested in the aforementioned stuff, also kept a rational, agnostic attitude about it and approached it from a far more academic perspective than a religious one. I was excited because this is rare where I live, in a very religious town. We actually spoke on the phone before we met, which is something I usually insist on to weed out the weirdos. In hindsight, I realized the first weird thing was after we hung up the first time. He called me back despite me saying I was going to bed, but I let it go. Maybe he didn't see my text. Fast forward to the first meet. I asked him if he wanted to meet at a very popular local park. He said yes, but that he wanted to sit by the tennis courts specifically, as these are located on the same street, but they are a few houses that separate them from the main park. I thought it was part of the park, but I was actually wrong. It was owned by our local university, and this detail is relevant for later. I asked if he was into tennis, and he just said yes, and asked if he wanted to play, but he said he didn't have good equipment. I figured he just wanted to watch people play tennis or something. It stood out but wasn't a red flag yet. I got there before him, watched people play tennis for a while and thought, oh, maybe that's why he wanted to meet me here. Whoever got here first would be able to watch tennis and not be bored waiting. He spooked me because he snuck up on me. 1 second he wasn't there and the next he was introducing himself. I'm very observant of my surroundings and kept looking for him because he told me which direction he'd be walking from, as this was just down the street from his house, and to this day I don't know how he did it. I'm always sneaking up on others, sometimes on purpose because I can be an arse, and sometimes by accident, and this shook me, and I was discombobulated. I realized his photos were very bad on his profile. He was a very attractive guy in person, but his pictures where he would smile in a selfie just looked off. I don't smile so much in pictures, so I wondered if maybe it was because he was the same but trying to get past it. I don't know how to elaborate more than that. There was just something distinctly odd about his smile in pictures. I didn't notice it in person at all, which made me immediately wonder when we met if I was overly judgmental of people's photos. In hindsight, I'm not. Things started out a little awkward on his part. My style is just to say, "Hi, I'm Felicity," and start talking like we've met before. Most people love this. I love this. No job interview vibes, just two people hanging out. But there was something markedly different about him in person. On the phone he was chatty, witty, imaginative, and seemed to have a passion for life. In person he made fun of people nearby playing tennis because they weren't following the rules and ended up playing some funny awkward form of tennis volleyball. They were young teens, so I felt he was being a real ass. He was obviously checking out other chicks, not just noticing people come and go. There's a difference. Condescending about nearly everything I talked about and made some weird comment like he was very frugal. On the phone he said he spent too much money on travel and books, and his goal for the month was to not spend money on every beverage, but he was still going to drink coffee. I was like, coffee's a beverage, you're cheating. He legit got mad and said coffee is a necessity, and also he makes it the night before, so it doesn't count for the day. Wait, what? That makes no logical sense. Who wants stale coffee? He also said he follows a very strict diet because he knows exactly what it'll look like coming out. I wasn't following and he said, you know, when you poo. At this point, I legit wondered if maybe he had some sort of disorder that would affect social interaction, but as someone who was on the spectrum and has friends and family who are, that just didn't feel right. So I thought, maybe he's just a jerk and probably trying really hard to appear smart and deep, hence the weird comments. I told him I needed to get home and check on my pal Ball's python, as I owned and bred them, and it's a great way to creep out the creepy guys. Not before he told me I had an orange-brown aura. I said that was cool because I love being outside during the autumn, and he just stared at me blankly. I offered to drive him home. Why did you do that? As he had walked, and I guess I was kind of nosy about which house was his. I also wanted to show off my car. Ego here. He said he was surprised. I was a professional, not a waitress or something. He worked at a Fazoli's, literally 2-minute drive away, parked in front of his house, and he asked me out for Thursday. It was Monday. My response was I couldn't for obvious reasons, and I could tell he was contemplating inviting me in or kissing me goodbye. He asked me how I felt about a goodbye kiss, and I said I had no feeling one way or another, again dumb, as he was very weird but was very good looking, and I figured a kiss goodbye for what definitely would be forever wouldn't be horrible. Well, this obviously pissed him off, because I was giving him no feedback, just to see what would happen, and I think he knew that, and he suddenly started telling me how I looked different than my photos. All of them are recent with no filters, and one was a professional headshot. The rest were just snaps from my iPhone. I asked him how so, because I was genuinely puzzled, and he said he was shocked. Someone like me. He referred to me as an intellectual, previously, which I'm not sure if he meant as a compliment or insult, would wear the leggings I had. They're just plain old leggings with a southwestern print, no crazy colours. I must have not reacted the way he wanted because he continued. He also said I looked heavier in person, and he said I also was darker than he thought I was. I am mixed race, ethnically Jewish and Native American, and this really pissed me off and made me think he was racist. But I casually said, well, yeah, I've been in the sun the past week, and laughed. I said, that's interesting. Good night. He got out my car and said, I bid you adieu, and not the French kind. I am assuming he meant to insult me further by a Freudian implication of not French as in kissing, or maybe he was just dumb and I'm reaching. But I replied, if it's spelt that way in French, and drove off, and promptly bought a milkshake and a huge order of mozzarella sticks on the way home. I asked some dude friends of mine if I did in fact look bigger in person. I'm ashamed I asked, but the answer was a resounding no, and forget the guy, he was just pissed he didn't get laid. Now I wish the story ended here because it would be one I could laugh about in hindsight. Kind of. But maybe not, because I had a nagging feeling about this dude, something I couldn't pinpoint in my mind's eye. The more I thought about everything in context, his vibe was just so dark during the date at times. Eye contact with no blinking, that's weird. It weirds me out even though I'm usually huge on eye contact. And the negging that was quite cruel. So I googled his name, and he's on the sex offenders registry for soliciting from an underage girl when he was 23. She, 13. He's 38 now, for context. If it wasn't bad enough, he broke his probation by pleading guilty to stalking and got sent to jail for 120 days. He was a college student when this happened, and the girl was a college student too. I'm sure much younger than him. I have access to a few databases and found court documents. He was a stranger. He stalked her en route to school and on campus, even on the shuttle bus. He got kicked out of university and couldn't go back on campus ever. I got a message from him in the morning apologizing, and responded with no worries, good luck out there, because I did not want this guy to be angry at me for obvious reasons. I reported him to the dating site and his profile got taken down. He contacted me again and said, if you had an issue with me, you could have just told me, and I played dumb. He believed me and vented about it, admitted to being an offender, and I pretended to be sympathetic and said I had a family member on the registry for peeing outside. That was a lie, but I do have a cousin who almost got in trouble for peeing outside when we were kids, and then he stopped messaging me. Thank God. I usually would have gone no contact, but my town isn't that big, and I didn't want this person having a grudge against me. I did more research and found out he couldn't go to the main park because sex offenders aren't allowed to go to parks with playground equipment, hence the tennis courts. Also, most people into auras interpret orange as sexual energy, I think. Because I don't have revealing photos on my dating site, my big, very non-juvenile boobs probably turned him off since he likes teenaged girls. Vomit. I think he's into metaphysical stuff because it's a community that's very open-minded and probably more willing to forgive his charges. The diet thing was probably because he was in a cell with a toilet, and I'm going to assume that in a small space, you smell your body waste, for lack of a classier term, for a long time. Can you buy an air freshener from commissionary? Maybe I should consult Orange is the New Black. Also, the weird social stuff aligns with antisocial personality disorder more than autism or Asperger's, according to one of my diagnostic psychological books from college. I am traumatized. I could not stop thinking about it, and analyzing this for days on end. Literally one of the most normal, sane conversations I've had on the phone pre-date, well-dressed and groomed, and was very young looking for his age. Ew, he did actually have the same birthday as me according to his registration page, and shouldn't have had any issues finding dates. But I now know why he's single. If you'd have told me there's a sex offender messaging you, I would have guessed other people as a possibility over this dude. So I bought a background check membership, and refused to ever meet up with anyone from the internet without doing one. Not that face-to-face dating during a pandemic is what it used to be, but even talking on Skype. I want to know. Paranoid? Yes. Peace of mind? Yes. Thankfully he does not know where I live, or my full name, as I had installed Ring security in my house the day we started talking, and I had actually mentioned it casually. In my life, I have neither seen or felt anything I would classify as paranormal. Yet, I do believe it does exist, except what I decided to call the window episode and some Ouija tests. Here's my story. It must have been during high school. I was home just after being left alone by my father and brother, so I decided to make something to eat for myself when I heard it. Some rather strong knocks against my window. I assure you I was convinced my father or brother were back to get something that they must have forgotten, and just warned me of their presence. There had to be someone around the window. But there was nothing. No one. I checked all the windows in the house, but still nothing. So I just freezed for a few seconds, not understanding what happened. Was it bugs? Is it impossible for an insect to cause such a loud noise, multiple times? Birds, perhaps? The wind? In any case, could it have been the neighbors? But then again, they live on the opposite side of where my brain has located the sound, and I had definitely recognized the noise that my windows could produce. I had thought about this during at least more than 1 year, searching for any explanation, but there was still none. But there are two elements drawing my attention in this episode. First, I heard the noise a bit after being left alone, as if the thing that caused the noise was heading towards me and just waiting for me to be alone. Then I recently noticed that the window episode coincides with the period where I made a Ouija with friends. It wasn't a very troubling experience. The glass was moving, forming more or less credible answers, that's all. But if the window noise is linked to my Ouija experience, I admit it's a bit more troubling. I have to talk about this with my friends. I have to talk about this with the friends I made the Ouija with. None of them gave me any other explanation, and I haven't told my family this. Not even sure if they take it seriously. I worked as a food delivery person in a hospital when I was younger. I mainly worked on the floor that was like a nursing home for older patients. I took a tray into a room once and asked the woman if I should leave it on her tray or if she was going to get up and go to her table. She told me not to bother because she wouldn't be needing food anymore. I was required to leave it, so I just said okay and left it on the table. I went back about an hour later to pick up trays and her room was empty. She'd passed away. I'll never forget that. I used to work med-surg. Sometimes when the ICU had room, they'll put some overflow patients down there, and we'll float down to take care of them. About 3 or 4 months ago I floated down there. It was great because I only had to manage 3 patients, and I'm used to having 6 or 7. I hear some commotion and yelling down the hall, so I ran down there to see if the nurses needed help. I get to the room and see the nurse tech backed against the wall crying, and 3 ICU nurses trying to hold this man down, while a 4th gives him Altivan. Apparently he was withdrawing really bad from both alcohol and narcotics. I listened to him and realized what he was freaking out about. He was trying to sit up and scoot back, and he's screaming, "My legs, let go of my legs, you're burning me. Guys, it's trying to pull me off the bed and it's burning me." His legs were in soft restraints, and the nurse by his feet was trying to check to see what was wrong with them. But she wasn't pulling on them at all. But even when she wasn't touching his feet, he was screaming. Because someone wouldn't let go and they were burning him apparently. Almost like a demon was trying to pull him to hell. He died within about an hour and a half of that. I don't know why, but it scared me so badly that I thought I was going to puke for the rest of the night. My dad is a doctor. When he was a resident, he attended a woman who was in an ATV, the 4-wheeler type. It was a big accident. After a few surgeries, they managed to stabilize her. My dad didn't perform surgeries, he just assisted. A few days later, when he was doing routine checkups on her, she was awake and he came in the room. My dad asked her a few questions, and after a few of them she interrupted him, sat down on the bed and said, "You're a really good doctor. You've done what you can, but it's of no help. I'm gonna die very soon." My dad claimed she looked very pale and said those words very calmly, and died a few hours after that. I have cared for many elderly residents passing away, but my favorite story was a sweet lady called Vi. She was very weak and just beginning the process of actively dying. We were trying to pull her nightgown up to make sure she was dry, but she started fighting us tooth and nail to keep her gown down, while she stared into space. She'd never given us any lick of trouble in the department, and she had no modesty issues with the staff. We waited a couple of minutes and tried again, but she kept looking at the ceiling and batting us away with her hand. She was stone deaf, so there was no point explaining ourselves. Finally, on our 3rd attempt, Vi motioned with her hand and shouted, "Not in front of the angels." We backed off for a while after that, and she passed away that same night. Years ago, my father worked security at a hospital. The only place he didn't like patrolling was the morgue. There really wasn't a whole lot going on in the morgue, but sometimes the dead people on the table or vault would get up, moan, fart, burp, and other things that dead bodies do. Even though my father knew there was no need to worry, it still startled him. Sometimes a hospital nearby would use the morgue if they had overruns, and also the local police department would use it. So one day my dad's at work. He's talking to a receptionist called Debbie, who is a large, middle-aged older woman, and seems to be in okay health. They're just chit-chatting, usual small talk, and she lets him know she's really not feeling good today, and that she hasn't felt good for the past few days. My father mentions to her that maybe she just needs to go home and rest. She's been working hard, and perhaps needs to take it easy for a while. As they're talking, she says, "No, this is a different kind of feeling," and that she genuinely feels really bad. So my father goes back at the end of his shift to check up on her and says he'll catch her on Monday because it's Friday and the weekend's coming up. Right as he was leaving the hospital though, he was overcome with a very uneasy feeling. So Monday comes in and she doesn't show up for work. Tuesday and Wednesday roll around and she still doesn't come in. So my father asked her co-workers about her, and they hadn't heard from her, so my father guesses she must be taking some time off. The week progresses and Friday comes around. While making his rounds, he has to inspect the morgue. As he goes in, he does a quick sweep, but his eyes are drawn to a fresh body laying on the slab in the middle. He casually shines his flashlight in the direction when his stomach drops. He sees the body of his co-worker lying there on the slab, dead. At the time of these events, my brother, my father and I, a 16-year-old male, are road tripping through Nevada and California as my graduation gift. It was the end of August, and after a long trip coming from Las Vegas, cruising through Los Angeles and heading north across California, we decided to stay in beautiful Santa Barbara for a few days. My father finds a motel not too far from the beach, and we were all in wonder as to the movie-like beauty of the city we're staying in. In the evening of our first night there, being back to the motel shortly after feasting on greasy and savory pizza from Rusty's Pizza Parlor, and walking along one of the most beautiful beaches in the USA, I start to get bored in the room. After having watched the television with my father and brother for about an hour, to change the scenery a bit, I decide to peek through our room window. As I kneel on the raspy purple carpet floor and draw the thick and heavy curtains out, a sense of dread takes hold of my whole being. I'm startled by the thing I see right across the street, about 100 feet from my window. What I'm looking at is at odds with the beautiful, picture-like frame created by the motel lobby entrance arch, delimiting it from my field of view. A beautiful shadow and light setting created by the streetlight beam on the pavement of the other side of the road reveals this man, whose physical traits are hooded by the shadows cast down towards by the light. Right under the streetlight, he is standing half in the light, half in the dark of night, as if the knowing of the effect the light has on him. He looks like he's in his late 20s, early 30s, and stares right at me. His gaze like a laser beam, and I can feel it all the way down to my kidneys. I can't see his crazy eyes from the distance, but I can feel them, and my subconscious picks up on the intent, which isn't good. He seems to have waited for me to look at him for a long time, as if he knew it would happen. He seems to have known, just as you know when you'll hear thunder after seeing lightning. A few seconds after he's made aware of my awareness of his presence, still staring at me, he starts, in a slow clockwork motion, sliding his index finger sideways across his throat, underneath his jaw from right to left, over and over, as if he's silently telling me, "I'll kill you." That's right. As the floor beneath me starts to sink, and a little taste of metal overwhelms the top of my tongue, I close the curtains as quick as if my life depended on it. Then, I turn my upper body away from the window towards my father and tell him what I've seen. He just kind of shrugs it off, talking over the baseball game on TV, and tells me to let it go. But I can feel, along with this calm vibe of arrogant carefreeness coming from him, a hint of uneasiness that I can taste in the back of my mouth. 30 seconds go by, and I stupidly kneel uncomfortably again on the motel carpet below the windowsill. After loudly swallowing for luck, against my best judgment, I draw the curtains out a second time, but this time my hand stops at the width of my head, allowing to view just enough of the outside world to be able to grasp what was happening outside of my seemingly safe motel room. There he is again. This time though, the man is standing 2/3 of the way to where he stood the first time I saw him. His facial traits are now darkened by the lack of streetlight, but I can still feel his crazy glare. He is under the hotel lobby parking lot arch. There's not much light there where he stands, but I can still perceive him doing his throat-slicing gesture, and is still communicating it to me through the pantomime. There is this desperate feeling of unfair doom in realizing that your poor vulnerable self is the target of something malicious, that doesn't know you as being with needs and fears, but knows and wants something from you which you are oblivious to. I'm starting to feel queasy, and frightened. I close the curtain quickly once again and tell my dad of the man's presence, and he's approaching the room. I get on the bed trying to concentrate on the TV to forget what I'd just witnessed. I don't remember if my dad looked through the window to confirm what was happening, but I remember him telling me to stop looking outside if that's what was scaring me, and that we were safe in the room, which is locked. After what seemed like a few minutes passing, I peek again for the final time. This time the man is right in the parking lot, about 50 feet from our motel room, doing his gesture again. I start thinking that this man is probably mentally ill or something, and that I better stop looking at the window again. A clever thing to do, I tell myself. The man's behavior, although redundant and pathetic, nevertheless strikes me as being ominous and frightening. The night goes on with that feeling that even if I'm probably safe inside our room, there is this disturbed man missing a few cogs who's got nothing to lose outside the room, that behaves as if he wants nothing good for me. Would he be grinning or not? Would he raise his arms to gently tap the window while kneeling under the windowsill? I try not to think about it, and I sleep very uneasily that night. The following morning, not wanting to go outside of the room, I decide to stay in with my brother while my dad goes into the motel lobby to fetch orange juice breakfast and to speak to the motel clerk about the man outside. My father comes back after a few minutes with our breakfast and tells me that the clerk told him the guy who frightened me the night before is known in the area for his mental illness. He's probably a schizophrenic. And my dad then reassured me that the clerk told him he's not dangerous, and that we're safe staying there for a few more nights. Luckily, I never see the man again for the duration of our stay. Fast forward a few years. My father and I are reminiscing about our trip to California, and specifically about those days in Santa Barbara, when the mentally ill man threatened me with his finger outside our motel room is mentioned in the conversation. My father, as if relieved from not having to keep this secret anymore, lets out that the morning after that dreadful night, the motel clerk had in fact told him to be careful with the man. He had told him that in fact he was dangerous. My dad just didn't want to scare us by telling us the truth. I thanked him for lying to me that morning, and we agreed that we were lucky that we didn't see that man again. So me and this group of women, all of us friendly acquaintances that did group hikes, were hiking single file on a very thin trail through the mountains. My one problem with this group was that they insisted on talking loudly throughout the hike. I like to try and spot wildlife, so I ended up being in the front of the line in the hopes that I would see some critters before all the loud chatter drove them off. So I'm walking in the front, chilling, admiring all the thick forest and trees, and I take a step and put my foot down. As I do that, I hear a rustle, so I look down and I lift up my other foot to take another step. Less than an inch from my toes was this huge snake. I never saw how long it was, but it was around 3 inches in diameter and it started moving. Now this area had about 3 different types of rattlesnakes, along with copperheads, cottonmouths, and very rarely coral snakes. So I've been taught a healthy respect for snakes, as well as how to tell the difference between most of the species. I didn't even get a good look at the color before my hindbrain kicks in. This huge jolt runs through my body, like I stuck a fork in a socket. And before I even fully comprehend, oh hey, there's a snake, I'm 3 feet in the air and trying to travel backwards. I like to imagine it as one of those graceful anime leaps where they jump 20 back before a fight. But in reality it was more like a terrified cat springing into the air shouting, "Jesus Christ!" I crash into the woman behind me who yelps and turns to face me, but as she does she spots the snake and starts yelling at the top of her lungs. I was the one who nearly stepped on it, and this lady was more scared than I was. Well, the snake is no fool and decides, screw this, I was just chilling and sunning myself and these ladies come along and start screaming. I'm out of here. Thanks for ruining my morning. It slithers off into the undergrowth, and when it does, I see that its scales are pitch black. It is literally just a rat snake. both harmless and friendly. My grandma has 6-foot rat snakes living in her backyard, and she feeds them leftover chickens sometimes. Totally harmless. I felt like one hell of a fool, but that snake scared the bejesus out of me, and one of the other women took up the head of the lion for quite some time afterwards. This actually happened at my friend Mackenzie's house, which she had only lived in for about a year or two at the point of the event. I don't know when, but I came over to her house to use the Ouija board before anything crazy really happened. We set up candles, switched off the lights. I even read somewhere online that you can use a silver coin to keep a spirit from sneaking through, so I put one on the board. Literally nothing happened, and we got bored. So we went into the garage to listen to Edgar Allan Poe poetry because it was far scarier. And although nothing happened, I felt like I'd mention us doing this, so you can all scold me in the comments for being stupid and using a Ouija. Just don't get your hopes up, because we continue to do dumb stuff throughout the whole experience. And I thought I'd mention it because this is when we got the name for the ghost. Mackenzie's sister, who is also named Mackenzie, said something about talking to Tabuta, the first woman accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trials. Me and my friend are dumb and had no clue who Tabuta was, so when weird stuff started happening, we just started calling it Tabuta. If the spirit of the real Tabuta is hearing this now, I'm sorry. Now, for the actual experience. This happened on Friday the 5th, 2016. Mackenzie and I were hanging out and decided we wanted to take some Polaroid pictures in the backyard. The sun was setting to the point where it was dim out, but we could still see everything. Mackenzie was standing at the top of the stairs to the dock, while I stood on the lower part and posed for the picture. Looking away from her, as I was standing, I heard her start running down the stairs saying, "I don't know what that is," over and over. If I'm being completely honest, I thought she saw a bug, which scared the hell out of me because I'm terrified of insects. We both ran out, over to the very end of the dock, and I asked her what she saw. She said she was about to take a picture of me, and she heard rustling behind her in the bushes. And when she turned, she saw a tall, almost blacked out figure creeping out from the bushes. After hearing that, I was afraid it was a home intruder or something, and we were both too scared to walk back, which leads to stupid thing number 2. Because we were so freaked out, we waited too long and the sun eventually set all the way. I had a terrible Android phone, so I had to download a flashlight app, and we ran back into her house in practically pitch darkness. Before we started running, Mackenzie snapped a photo on her camera. There's nothing on it. The blur is her finger, but I might still add it. I had to go home that night, but I made sure to come back the next day. When it was the next day, I came back as soon as I could to investigate. I took many videos, but unfortunately couldn't catch any of the craziest stuff on camera. Mackenzie's cousin was in the house with us, and we all went back out to the top deck to check out the scene. While we were out there, Mackenzie's cousin's phone died at about 30% and would not switch back on. We didn't really think about it too hard, but when we went back inside, Mackenzie's phone began to glitch as well. Every time she typed her password, it would reject it, and I can vouch for her because I knew her password at the time. Her Siri started going off and saying random stuff, and eventually her phone straight up died as well. Mackenzie's computer was on, and if you've never used Google Hangouts, when you type in the chat you can see when someone else is online and when they're typing. And in the chat it clearly showed that Mackenzie's cousin was online and typing, despite her dead phone being the only electronic she could use Hangouts on. After a while of nothing happening, we were watching all the videos I had taken on my iPad, and were joking about the ghost. Dumb thing number 3. We all started antagonizing it and making fun of it, calling it all kinds of names. And man, I can't make this stuff up. Mackenzie's dead phone from across the room, in her Siri voice, said, now, like it was scolding us. Before you say anything, I know the phrase is just programmed into the Siri, but none of us had touched the phone in at least a half hour, and it was completely dead from what we could tell. Needless to say, we all practically crapped ourselves and ran out of there screaming. Now this is where it gets even weirder. Because we were so freaked out by what happened in the room, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to calm down. Since my sister was the oldest in our friend group, Mackenzie wanted to call her because of what happened. When my sister answered the phone, she specifically said the words, "I'm sorry to call you. I'm just too scared to be in my house right now." Literally a week earlier, my sister had a dream in which Mackenzie called her on the phone and said the exact phrase verbatim. In the dream, a group of people had killed and eaten her pet cat, Kahuna, who unfortunately was killed by dogs shortly after this. That wasn't the last time my sister predicted cats dying in her dreams, but that is a whole other subject to tackle on another day. After we told her what occurred in the dream, Mackenzie freaked out, and we ran back to the house and to call the animals out so nothing bad could happen to them. Her mum arrived home as we were all huddling out in the front yard with their cat and pit bull, and she yelled at us. After that, nothing happened for the rest of the day, but odd things would still occasionally happen at her house. I've heard footsteps in her attic, and they actually had a pest control person check up there because of the noise, but there was no proof that anything was living there. I wasn't here for this, but one night Mackenzie was watching Rick and Morty in her room, and her laundry basket just slid across the floor right in front of her. Thankfully, the activity has pretty much dissipated, and nothing that odd has happened in a while, other than the spider bed, but then again, that's another story. My boyfriend and I were doing a road trip around Scotland last year. We were sleeping in the car during the nights, and would get up, pack everything, and head somewhere else the next day. One night we stayed in this gorgeous bay right by the sea. Beautiful sunset, lots of other campers, it was ideal. We liked it so much we wanted to hang around the area a bit longer, so the next night we stayed in the same bay. However, when I got back to the bay to set up camp for the night, there was no one else there. Bit weird, but whatever, no big deal. It was late when we arrived and it was already starting to get a bit dark. My boyfriend started cooking dinner. As he was doing so, I decided to take some rubbish over to the bins about 100 feet away. I got to the bins and suddenly heard this weird hissing sound at the top of the cliffs next to us. It just kept going on and on up there, then it stopped, so I thought it might be owls. They do weird stuff like that, right? Then I heard it again. Only this time it was coming down the cliff to my level, and it was approaching me. I shone the torch around, but couldn't see anything, so I legged it back to the car and told my boyfriend. He sort of shrugged and carried on cooking, then suddenly stopped. He looked off to where I heard the noise for a moment, then started packing the car. I asked him what was going on, but he just said to keep packing. We got in the car, packed up, and we were preparing to leave when headlights came from down the lane. A police van drove past towards the end of the bay and looped back and left again. No idea what that was about. Either way, we left the bay and found somewhere more populated to stay. When I asked my boyfriend why he'd wanted to leave so quickly, he said he heard the exact same thing I had heard, the hissing from up the cliffs, descending to our level and approaching, getting louder. Noped right out of that place the very next morning. This happened during our long weekend getaway, a while ago. My friends and I decided we deserved a bit of a break from our usual surroundings, and targeted somewhere 3 hours away for a 4-day weekend. We tried booking for a beach house either south or central coast, but due to demand with the pandemic and everyone wanting a local getaway, as well as school holidays, we couldn't find a suitable location which would fit 14 people. Luckily, I found a place a 5-hour drive away from our area. Not the usual place we'd normally go. This was a good 1 hectare area, unusually shaped home in the middle of it all with a saltwater pool right in front of the house, with the next house a good 500 meters away or more. We normally go for beachside accommodation, but due to the aforementioned reason we had to settle for this one. You can tell when the property ended as it was fenced, but there was a gate that is chest high with a padlock, which we didn't have the key to, which had a latch, so pretty much anyone can just open and close as they please, and this detail is important for the story. We didn't really worry about it that much, as we were away from everyone else, which means that we can do karaoke and watch scary movies without worrying about noise. It was an amazing break in accommodation, but for one particular event. In total, we took 5 cars. We parked our cars close to where the fenced pool is, as we came in staggered stages. Check-in was at 3 p.m. on Friday, and 9 of our friends were already there by the time we started to drive. They shared photos and videos of the place and were already enjoying themselves. The views and facilities, myself, my fiance's sister, and 2 other friends left close to 7 p.m. and got to the area past midnight. It was a creepy drive for the final 2 kilometers as it was extremely dark, and you have to drive past tall trees with no lampposts and cross the train tracks to get entry out of the place. Our friends greeted us at the gate, as they were worried about the darkness. We parked our cars, caught up with them before heading to bed at around 2. Saturday came and we had brekkie, went up for a drive up north to check out the sights, and went back before dark as we needed to use the outside grill for our dinner. I didn't really want anyone to hang out outside in the dark, as there's no visibility, and can't ever be too safe. We had drinking games inside, the girls did karaoke, or taking soju shots until 3 a.m. The next day, the topic was the fun that we'd had the night before, and one of the girls threw up from all the uncontrolled drinking. We had late breakfast and planned to have sausage sizzle, which is grilled sausages squeezed in a piece of white bread with caramelized onion and your choice of barbecue or tomato sauce. For lunch, again, when that required the outside grill. I wasn't fast as it was 2 p.m. and most of us were just hanging in the pool area, which was adjacent from the dining area next to the grill. As we were eating, my view is towards the cars, and where we would be coming from if we decided to go to the pool area from the main house. When I see this woman wearing a pink bucket hat, and I was wondering who it could be from our group, and quickly realized she wasn't part of our group. I thought she was one of the distant neighbors, and we were too loud the night before and that the noise traveled and she was there to complain. Others thought that she'd booked the place and maybe there was a problem with the booking. But she approached and said, I apologize, I know you guys are here to have fun and have a bit of a break, but I used to own this place until it was turned into an Airbnb by the current owner. By this time she was standing in front of us in the center, and she took off her hat and we saw that she's most likely been through chemotherapy. I sold this house in 2018, and it was a very hard decision. I was wondering if I could take a look inside the house and maybe quickly show my friends what it looks like on the inside, as it's an architecturally designed home and very unique. My fiance's brother quickly said, no, while some of the girls were looking at each other considering her request, as she seemed genuinely emotional and looked like she'd been through something. I followed up with, we're checking out tomorrow morning. I can contact the current owner and let her know that you want to check the place out after we leave. She quickly responded, no, it's alright. Are you guys from Sydney? We responded that we were, and she said that she now lives round there too, and is staying nearby for the next week, and was trying her luck in having a look at the house. It seemed she was establishing that she was the previous owner, and she mentioned that the new owners added an additional tank, and asked if the garden towards the back of the property has been removed because it was a problem before, and asked if the red chandeliers still existed. We knew the chandelier is white, not red, and if we had access to all rooms including the ones next to the grill, as we only had access to one of the 2 rooms as the other was padlocked, we said yes. I quickly had a look towards the gate and saw that there was a 4WD right outside blocking it. One of my friends had the wit to ask her name and if she knew the current owners, or maybe she could ask them for permission instead. She responded with, My name's Karen, and we exchanged paperwork online, so I didn't really know them personally. She then asks if she can just have a look outside, and we let her. About 30 seconds later, she comes back and asks what the current owners have done with the part of the area. We mentioned we didn't know, and it's probably owned by the neighbor. She then responded with, "Oh, the owner's father owns that property." She thanked us and walked towards the gate, all the while checking out the house. I then messaged the owner letting her know that there was a woman there called Karen who wanted to check the house out. The owner replied saying, "That's odd, there's no previous owner named Karen. I'll let the caretaker who lives down the road know about this." We created all these scenarios in our head. What if the padlocked room was where she wanted to check out? We didn't see her friends, so we didn't know who we had to deal with. We are glad we didn't let her in, as we didn't know what anyone's capable of. Also, we pointed out her bravery in approaching a group of strangers to check out the house, when she could have easily contacted the owner to ask her instead if she had a week in the area. We then checked out the property history and found that the house was built in 07, sold in 13, and again in 2018. The property photos had the red chandelier prior to it being sold in 2013, which means it wasn't hers to begin with. Her spiel made it sound like she had the house built, and she lived on the property for a good 10 years. We were pretty much on edge that night. Every little noise we would jump at, assuming it was her and her friends coming back to take a closer look. Who knows what her plans really were? The last place I worked, like so many other wards here in Denmark, had a 6-hour room, where dead patients stay for 6 hours before they're checked again for signs of death and moved to the morgue, still attached to the hospital. It's rather large. Not sure if that's a thing in other countries. The patients are required to have a call line within reach in case they wake up and are in fact not dead. So there are 5 or 6 call lines in the room. Anyway, it was an ER, and we had a fair amount of dead patients wait in that room over the years. Every now and then, and usually during a night shift, the call light would go on from that room, even without any patients in there. You just have to go down there, turn them off again, and sometimes they would go on again just as you left the room. Creepy as hell. I never liked going down there. I always felt alone. I don't know, it was thick or tense. The technicians came and checked the connections and stuff, but everything worked without any problems. I was taking care of an elderly patient. A very, very elderly patient. Actually, the oldest person I've ever taken care of. I don't remember why she was admitted, but it was minor, and she was due to go home the next day. She was A&O times 3, a very sharp lady, and she and I were having a nice little chat, and I was getting ready to wrap things up when she said, "I just want to know, who's that little girl who's standing behind you?" The hairs on the back of my neck raised up. I ran through a quick assessment again. She knew who she was, where she was, what year it was, why she was in the hospital, yet seeing invisible children in her room. What? I assured her there was no one else in the room. She's very nonplussed about it. I go outside the nurse's station and have the "my patient is hallucinating ghost children, please help" conversation with my nurse in charge, and she goes, "Oh, your patient is in room 26? Yeah, I figured. She's the 3rd or 4th person we've had there who's seen little children in that room." I work as a teletech while I'm in school, and when the unit secretary leaves for lunch, I will cover the desk for the time being, since it's right outside the tele room. I was sorting the heart rhythm strips, and someone walked up to the desk and said he was looking for the exit. I pointed him in the direction right as I looked up to acknowledge him standing there, and saw he was in a gown with the wristband. So I asked him his room number and to wait while I called his PCA to walk with him downstairs. I called the PCA and gave her the room number. She told me, "That can't be the right room. That patient died about 20 minutes ago. Was it his family?" I told her he had a wristband on, but maybe I had heard or was given the wrong room number. She came to the desk to cover the monitors for me, and I went to go peek into the room he told me and see if it was the wrong room and to find which room he was in. Sure enough, laying dead in the bed was the same guy who walked up to the desk no longer than 10 minutes before I went in there. I am a nurse who used to work the graveyard shift in a psych unit in a large hospital outside Chicago. Normally there would be 2 nurses in our shift, but on this particular night we had Joyce, who was still on orientation phase. When it was Joyce's turn at around 2 a.m. to have a 1-hour break, the charge nurse Pam told her she may use the MSW's office at the end of the hallway, so the night supervisor couldn't see her sleeping. This office has a couch which anyone can comfortably sleep. About half hour passed, and I saw Joyce in the hallway looking so terrified. Pam quickly glanced up at her from the computer. "You're up too early. Go back." Joyce, who's pale and out of breath, "I just had a dream. It was almost real. I dreamt that I was in the same dark office lying on the couch, and there was a black cat looking at me for a long time. Then, slowly, I felt like 2 hands were choking me in the dark. I couldn't breathe. Then the cat jumped across my body. Then at that moment, I woke up and it felt so real." Pam, who now had her full attention on Joyce, "Look at your neck. You have red scratches." There really were red scratches on Joyce's neck, like somebody or something held her neck for a long time. We didn't use that office for breaks anymore. I was in there myself when this happened and couldn't stand the darkness of the room. I felt like someone was watching me always and was never able to sleep at all. I used to work in a hospital built at the turn of the century. Nurses never went on rounds by themselves because something would happen. Banging doors, flickering lights, ghostly whispers, objects moved, you name it, it happened. Generally a rule of death stalks these corridors at night. Lots of reports of dark shadows and patients passing away. Scariest story while I was there? Isolation room at the end of the ward. The patient was visibly impaired and had basically no sight at all anymore. We're doing our rounds after midnight, around 3 a.m., and we hear him talking and having a grand old conversation and laughing. We walk in to find an empty room and our typically never ever confused patient insisting that his friend who died 3 years ago had been visiting him earlier. I was off the next 2 nights. Came back to find out that the patient had passed away at almost the exact time he had been talking to his friend the night before. A couple of friends and I drove into a horror movie once, by accident. It was either late November or early December, about 5 or 6 years ago. I was deeply religious at the time, and we were heading to one of those living nativity things where they have pretend actors to be the Virgin Mary, Joseph, the wise men, etc. And they kind of put on an outdoor show. It was held at a Christian campground outside of a nearby city, and we didn't know the area very well. We had someone give us directions. This was winter in the US, so it was already getting dark when we set out. We got to the area just fine, but we forgot the name of the exit we were supposed to take to reach the grounds. Luckily, the campgrounds had a big sign right next to an exit, so we assumed this was the way to go. We took the road and thought nothing of it. Crisis averted. The city this campground is next to is actually pretty large, and the exit we took is very close to a shopping district, so it wasn't like we started in the middle of nowhere. But very abruptly the exit turned from civilization to deep woods. We thought, well, it's a campground, so that's about right, and carried on driving. Pretty soon we passed a clearing on the right. The clearing was maybe 50 feet, and then woods again. And at the very edge of the woods, it wasn't full night yet so you couldn't see, was this huge stone gate with wrought iron doors. It looked like a cemetery gate, but it didn't lead to a path or anything, just trees. Had no fence around it either, just gate. So we kept going, remarking to each other that it was kind of creepy, but still we didn't think much of it. It was starting to get foggy at this point. I felt like maybe I should point out that despite it being winter, it wasn't that cold, and there wasn't any snow. A little while later, we came to some houses, and this is where things got weird. The first house was just standard white suburban house, but in the driveway, which was very short, was a van with all the doors open. The hazard lights were on too. The car was on, but nobody was in or around it, and the house was completely dark. We were a little nervous now, wondering if maybe something bad had happened, like an accident or something, and the driver of our car slowed down to look. Then my other friend in the front pointed ahead, and it turns out all of the houses on the street were like this on both sides of the road. Lights out, cars in the driveway, all of the doors on the cars open with the hazards on. At this point we were more than a little freaked out, thinking we'd driven straight into Silent Hill or a particularly mean prank if nothing else. Though it seems a little strange for it to just be a community-wide prank in the middle of winter, nowhere close to Halloween. We still haven't seen any people, mind you. For whatever reason, we still continued to drive, maybe to get out of there faster. There was a little bend in the road, and the instant we started through it, this massive black dog, sort of German shepherd looking thing, came out of nowhere and ran full tilt to the driver's side of the car. I'm still not sure if the dog actually made contact with the car, but if not, it did get incredibly close. After charging at us, it didn't retreat either. It stayed in the road, barking its heads off. Our driver did a quick U-turn and we got out of there as fast as possible, ditching the nativity thing, and never tried to go back. We found out when we got home and talking to the person who gave us directions that it wasn't even the right exit we were on, and now several years later, we're not exactly sure which exit we took that night. All I know is I'm glad we chose to get out of there when we did. I didn't want any part of whatever was going on that night. Hard pass, no thanks. This happened about 12 years ago when I was 15-16. Me and my parents took a trip from Pennsylvania to New York City to visit a foreign exchange student called Francis. We previously hosted him. He was back in America working in a restaurant, and we wanted to spend the weekend with him and taking out to some nice places. We got a nice upgrade at our hotel and had a luxury suite that had a bedroom where my parents would sleep and a big living room where me and Francis would sleep. The rooms connected, but both also had their own entrances to the hallway that faced each other in a little nook. Francis had to work till midnight the night we got there, so my parents went to bed and I stayed up to wait for him. Shortly after midnight, I hear a knock at the door to my parents' room. I assume Francis arrived, so I went to open the door for him before he woke up my parents. Didn't even check the peephole first. I opened the door to a large, mid-30-year-old man holding a gas can. He seemed startled that I opened the other door behind him and went, Hi, I was wondering if you could spare some money for gas. I replied, Oh, let me ask my parents. I close the door, go to the other room to wake up my mum, but she yells, Sorry, we can't help you. She definitely has better sense than me because my dumbass doesn't realize it's the middle of the night and we're on the 10th floor of a hotel. He didn't say anything in response. I checked the peephole and he was already gone. Francis showed up a half hour later and we had a great time for the rest of the weekend. But I still wonder what this guy's real intentions were, and what would have happened if one of my parents opened the door instead of me. When I was 12, my family, including my mum, my dad, my sister who was 16, and our dog, Dawn, moved into a mobile home in a mobile home park. I was a horrible child. I had no respect for my parents or their rules and ran away on several occasions. My parents were at the end of their tether, so they signed me up for 4-H and brought me my first pair of chickens. As I got further involved with the showing and showmanship, I acquired a good flock of chickens and needed a place to house them. My 4-H leader lived at a dairy farm across the street of the mobile home park and offered a good chunk of land to build an aviary. My 4-H leader, Mrs. Johnson, had a daughter my age, and we became fast friends. I went to the dairy every day and was shown all the daily happenings of dairy life. My favorite place was the sick pen, as I was going to be a veterinarian. I helped the vet and was even taught how to pull a calf if their mother was having trouble. I stuck my arm up there, but my arm wasn't long enough, and the vet let me help pull, and I got to tend to the calf once it was on the ground. Now to the meat of this story. My friend who lived in the dairy would love taking off our shoes and socks and walking through the cow pens, where there was thick manure, and it was slowly moving across the deep parts. We would get manure up to our legs and all over our clothes. The smell was horrible. One day we were walking through the pens, and I always knew the pens that held the bulls, and I knew better than to go into them, because bulls can get pretty aggressive when they're protecting their ladies. Sandy and I are nearing the middle of the pen when I look back, and she's sitting on the pipe coral just looking at me. I was confused until I saw the herd of cows part, and out steps the bull. We're staring at each other, and I notice which bull he is. It's Hurricane, the meanest bull at the dairy. I take a step back, but I'm in the deepest part of the manure and my feet are sticking. I take a step, and he takes a step, and he starts to snort loudly, telling me he's coming for me. I turn and try to run, but my feet are not working, and with every step I take, Hurricane takes two. I'm heading for the pipe coral, and just as I'm throwing myself headfirst into a diving motion through the pipes, I feel his head touch my feet as I fall to the ground in a sticker bush. Sandy and I never walked through the pens again, and we slowly lost interest in our friendship. I guess our friendship was held together by manure. To this day, every time I drove by one of the dairies and smelled the wafting scent of manure on a foggy day, I remember all the fun I had at the dairy, and also the day that I was nearly killed by Hurricane. I don't believe in ghosts, but I did see something once that I can't explain, and have chalked it up to a trick of the brain. Let's see what you think. I used to work in a resort deep in the Algonquin Park. It was basically rustic living for the super rich. It was a half-hour drive to self-service and an hour drive to the nearest town. I finished my late shift at about midnight, and I was walking back to my cabin. I clearly saw an elderly man with suspenders and a plaid shirt walking by me on the path. We were not allowed to speak to the guests unless they spoke to us first, so I didn't say anything to him. It was pretty dark, and I had to turn around to make sure that he was heading the right way to the guest cabins. And he had straight up disappeared. There was nowhere for him to go, except into the thick woods, and if he had done that, well, I would have heard it. Very strange. I had the pleasure of going on the Chernobyl tour 6 years ago in May. Kiev was so incredibly beautiful. Seeing what happened is devastating, but the tour was creepy. More mosquitoes than I've ever seen in my life. Only buildings we had free range in was an old elementary school. We got a poke inside the theatre, but not past the main entrance, and we could walk the stands at their football stadium. People still live there and in part of the buffer zone. There are still shops in the green zone, which I believe is a 5-mile radius from the plant. I remember when we pulled up to the plant and got out, our tour guide said, "Just so you know, this sarcophagus is very unstable and can collapse at any minute." That was my first "I don't want to be here" thought. On a side note, Ukrainians are some of the most hospitable, nicest and friendliest people I've ever met. I truly did not want to leave, and wish those still fighting for freedom their best of luck. The ocean always freaks me out. Imagine this. You're treading water on the surface of the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific, the deepest part of the world's ocean. There's a storm raging and the waters are violent. It's the middle of the night and everything is pitch black. The water is frigid cold, and wave upon wave relentlessly hit you under the surface. You glimpse a faint light from the moon slightly illuminating the turbulent waters as you struggle to stay afloat. Gasping for air, you glance around desperately, looking for anything that could help you. Your heart sinks as you realize there's nothing but ocean for thousands of miles. Then a giant wave slams you under the surface, plunging you deep into the water. As you sink into the dark abyss, the thought of 7 miles of water beneath you horrifies you, and you have no idea what terror lurks under the darkness. You struggle to push yourself back to the surface, but your arms and legs have given up. This is you. Anyone would be terrified of this. I know I was. This story is a few years old, but I remember it pretty well. When I was about 19 years old, I got hired in the fashion department of a local supercenter store. It's a bit like Walmart, but it's exclusive to the Midwest. At the time, I had the sides and back of my hair shaved, and the top of my hair was bleached blonde and twisted into a high bun. This is relevant to the story. I had just finished my computer training 2 days earlier and was on the floor alone stocking some baby clothes. About a box or two into my stocking, an announcement came over the speakers that informed customers our credit card readers were down, but we would be able to take cash at this time. I heard a couple of groans around me, but it seemed like most everyone was content to just go on shopping until it was announced that card readers were back up. I crouched down to grab some more clothes out of a box to shelve them, when a guy walked up to me holding a few items in his hand. "Hey miss, I just have a few items I wanted to buy real quick. Do you know how long the card readers will be down?" Me, still crouched on the floor. I'm not sure. I don't think this happens very often, but they say that they could still take cash for now. I only have card on me. Damn, that sucks. I'm sorry about that. Is there anything I can help you with while you need to wait? Nah, I guess I'll just hang around. I can stick over here and just bother you. I don't really respond to this comment, and just nodded and got back to folding. The man asked me a few more random questions before he started getting pretty creepy. The guy starts walking a bit closer to me, and he's at least a foot taller than I am. "So, why do you have your hair like that all bleached on top?" "Oh, I just like the way it looks." "No, that's not it. You're doing it for the attention." "Nope, I honestly just like the way it looks. Plus, the shaved parts keep me cooler in the summer." "What? Your family doesn't give you enough attention? You don't get enough attention from boys?" I don't know, I just like my hair like this." "Alright, well since you want attention so bad, how about I wait until you get off work, and I can show you the kind of attention I think you deserve." At this point in the conversation, he's practically hovering over me. I think I looked really intimidated because a woman immediately ran over to the two of us when she heard him say that. She quickly pulled me away, telling me that she needed help getting an item down from a high shelf. I'm not sure if the woman was genuinely trying to save me or really did just need help reaching something. I spoke to my manager about the event later in the day, and she informed me that there's nothing she can do for customers like that, and that I'll just have to deal with it. When I got off work that night, I practically ran to my car, praying that the guy wasn't waiting for me. I didn't stick around long enough to see if he was. I'd quit pretty soon after this because I was so shaken. I have no idea what he would have planned for me, but I'm so thankful for that woman. So, guy who thinks I deserve your creepy attention, let's not meet.